You have been told the Templars were destroyed, arrested at dawn, tortured into confessions, and burned at the stake until nothing remained but ash drifting through a Paris morning. That is the classroom version. However, neat endings are rarely offered by history. In this instance, something refuses to stay buried. There are too many traces, too many coincidences, and too many quiet doors across Europe that seem to open onto the same unspoken secret. What if the Templars did not die in the flames? What if they stepped into the dark instead? What if, beneath the familiar stories, they built a hidden network stretching from Scotland's cold hills to the sunlit harbors of Cyprus, one that continued long after their supposed destruction? If that is true, then the real mystery is not how they ended, it is how they survived. Let us slow down, take a breath, and allow the sharper edges of the story to soften a little as the noise fades and the old world settles around you again, steady and patient, as if waiting for you to lean closer. Imagine medieval Europe not merely as a collection of kingdoms and crusades, but as a vast web of roads, stone halls, quiet harbor towns, and fortified estates humming with movement. Picture messengers slipping between monasteries at night, riders vanishing into forests, and ships leaving unmarked docks before sunrise. In the middle of this network stood a brotherhood sworn to discipline, secrecy, and absolute obedience. They were indeed warriors, but more importantly, they were organizers, managers, and builders of systems. These systems could move money, relics, information, and people with a precision that would embarrass some modern institutions. Suddenly, one begins to understand why their disappearance never fully made sense. An organization of that magnitude cannot be erased overnight. It can only be driven underground. Tonight, you are stepping into that underground, not to chase myths, but to follow real traces left behind in dusty ledgers, carved stones, forgotten ports, abandoned commanderies, and political alliances that outlived their makers. You will observe how a network might vanish from public view, yet function perfectly in the shadows. As you follow its paths, you might notice small details that do not quite match the official story. A stray emblem, a puzzling land transfer, a fortification style appearing where it should not. These are the kinds of details polite historians sometimes step around, as though hoping no one else will notice. You begin with the familiar image, the knight in white, a red cross stitched to his chest, sword drawn in God's name, a holy warrior, a martyr in waiting. However, that is merely the silhouette the church wanted the world to remember. It is not the complete man. Strip away the romance of crusade and martyrdom, and what you will find beneath the tunic is something far more complicated and considerably more dangerous to the status quo. What made the Templars truly powerful was not the sword, but the system. The order was not just a militant brotherhood. It was a highly disciplined logistical empire, built for survival, movement, and message control. And it operated with clockwork precision. In a world of fractured kingdoms and primitive roads, the Templars created corridors of reliability. They established staging posts across Europe and the Levant, built fortified warehouses to stockpile resources, and organized land holdings with ruthless efficiency. A knight could ride from London to Jerusalem and never once sleep outside Templar protection. Inns, chapels, granaries, and treasuries marked their invisible grid. It was not about conquest, it was about continuity. At their peak, the Templars managed thousands of estates, farms, mills, and vineyards across multiple countries. These properties were not merely sources of income. They were nodes in a vast web of movement. Surplus grain in Burgundy could feed soldiers in Acre. Wool from England might be traded in Provence, generating the silver used to buy loyalty in Cyprus. Every transaction was tracked, and every route optimized. Long before the modern bank or logistics chain, the Templars had already invented both. But here is where it becomes strange. After the fall of Acre in 1291, The military purpose of the order was largely obsolete. The Holy Land was lost, and crusading fervor was dying. Yet, the machine did not stop. Estates continued to operate, money continued to move, and couriers still carried sealed scrolls across borders. The infrastructure lived on, quietly and efficiently, long after its battlefield rationale had faded. Why? That is where the questions begin to sharpen. Some scholars argue that the Templars simply did not know how to stop, that institutions often outlive their purposes through inertia, but others, whispering from the margins of academia, suggest something else, that the infrastructure was not just a relic, but a fallback, that the systems built to support crusades were repurposed to preserve the order itself, that survival was not a fluke, but a plan. Perhaps the clearest sign lies in what came next. When King Philip IV moved to dismantle the Templars in 1307, what he feared was not merely heresy or treasure, it was control. The Templars were not centralized in a royal court or a single fortress. Their strength was distributed, decentralized, difficult to pin down, and difficult to destroy. That is precisely what makes them relevant now. The men in white vanished quickly, yes, but the system did not. In fact, in some places, it seemed to become even more efficient, just less visible. Even today, medieval records show that payments continued to flow between commanderies years after the supposed destruction of the order. Letters appeared, bearing familiar seals. Land was transferred not to strangers, but to newly renamed charitable organizations with oddly similar structures. In one case, a French abbey petitioned to remove a Templar estate from tax rolls, only to admit under scrutiny that the original staff had never actually left. One obscure charter from southern Italy references a silent route used for transporting relics between former Templar strongholds. The wording is careful, almost evasive. It refers not to knights or priests, but to custodians. No swords, no crosses, just quiet stewards, continuing their work. There is no proof of a conspiracy, of course, but the language does not exactly scream disbandment. This is the first real crack in the official story. If the order was dismantled, why does the paperwork suggest otherwise? If the flame was snuffed out, how did the embers keep warming accounts across 3 continents? And perhaps most intriguing of all, who was still coordinating it? One theory suggests that a core group of Templar logistics officers, men trained not for battle, but for distribution, went into hiding before the arrests began. They anticipated the purge. Perhaps they saw the political winds turning. Either way, they may have used the very network they built for Crusades to scatter themselves, their records, and their protocols across Europe before Philip's men ever arrived, not with drama, not with swords drawn, but with ledgers quietly closed, keys handed to trusted heirs, and maps burned. If that is true, it would explain how subsequent generations found themselves managing properties with no clear owner. It would explain the recurring references to former Templars acting as advisors, estate managers, and treasurers in noble households from Aragon to Bavaria. It might also explain the eerie way that Templar infrastructure seems to shift shape after the fall, retaining function while shedding identity. A chameleon bureaucracy that never quite died because it was never designed to. And maybe, just maybe, you have already walked through part of it. That crumbling abbey on the edge of town, that strange octagonal chapel in the woods, that stone bridge that never quite lines up with the modern road. What if these were not random ruins, but arteries of something old, repurposed, and sleeping beneath your feet? After all, when something is built to outlast war, outlast kings, and outlast even its own name, perhaps it was never meant to be seen, only to function. Walk across the French countryside or through the sunken hills of northern Italy, and you may pass a ruin that means nothing to you, just another worn patch of stone, its arches crumbling, its name lost in dialect. But if you look closely, the shape might feel wrong. The alignment of the walls might suggest a former chapel, but not a typical one. Too fortified to be peaceful, too isolated to be simply holy. These were the commanderies, the operational hearts of the Templar network. Neither castles nor monasteries, and yet somehow both. Their placement, it turns out, was anything but random. The term commandery does not appear in grand chronicles or battlefield tales. These sites were administrative, not romantic. They were where money was counted, grain measured, weapons stored, and messengers dispatched. They did not wear glory on their sleeves. Instead, they hummed with the quiet noise of an engine room. Each commandery formed part of a larger grid, a distributed operating system that connected distant Templar properties through standardized practices and internal reporting, centuries before the concept of a bureaucracy was formalized. A well-established fact is that by the early 1300s, the Templars had established hundreds of these commanderies across Europe, from England and France to Hungary and the Holy Land. Each functioned like a regional headquarters, complete with barns, workshops, forges, armories, and often underground vaults. The commanders who ran them were not generals, but accountants and stewards. They filed detailed inventories, logged every harvest and payment, and could redirect assets across borders with uncanny speed. Now, here is where the story wrinkles. When researchers in the 20th century began to overlay the known locations of Templar commanderies on a map, strange patterns emerged. Some clusters aligned with old Roman roads. Others followed pilgrimage routes like the Way of St. James, and a few appeared along ley lines, those speculative, mystical currents beloved by fringe historians and scoffed at by academics. But one detail refused to disappear. Certain commanderies seemed positioned at regular intervals, as if part of a calculated design, not just convenient geography. This has sparked a quiet debate. Was the layout purely pragmatic, built where land was available and politics allowed, or was it something more deliberate? One French historian, dismissed in his time, suggested that the commanderies were spaced based on the average distance a mounted courier could ride in a day, allowing for a steady flow of encrypted messages and controlled handovers. He was laughed out of academic circles. Yet decades later, when medieval routes were cross-referenced with travel times and confirmed way stations, his estimates proved uncomfortably precise. That may be coincidence, or it may hint at an early form of relay communication, an analog information pipeline with logistical depth. And if that is true, it explains why the Templars could move data, treasure, or people across a continent faster than most kings could organize a feast. Some preserved parchments describe the movement of valuable goods using vague language. Sent to the brother at the next house, or delivered at the stage beyond the Black Ridge. No names, no towns, just internal code meaningless to outsiders. But some researchers believe these were references to an internal map now lost, a document that assigned discrete identifiers to each commandery. A map, not of countries, but of capacity. One of the more obscure finds comes from a crumbling archive in southern France, a series of linen-backed scrolls with what appears to be a symbolic travel chart. It includes no borders, no names of cities, just circles and lines, each marked with sigils and numbers. Some scholars believe it may have been a commander chart, an internal Templar schematic tracking not land but flow, the flow of goods, grains, silver, people. It was never meant to be read by outsiders. What strengthens this theory is how consistent the design of these commanderies was. From Aragon to Bohemia, the layout followed a strange but persistent pattern. Main house, chapel, outer wall, workshop, round tower, not always identical, but eerily familiar. Even the ratios of space, how much land was given to housing versus stables versus food production, followed a recognizable rhythm, almost like a template. When the order fell, these buildings did not burn. Some were handed to rival orders, some were sold off, but many simply remained, repurposed, emptied of symbols, but left standing, as if waiting for someone to return. There is a lingering question that has haunted Templar researchers for decades. If you connected the dots between all known commanderies, what shape would emerge? A network, a lattice, or something more symbolic? Some believe a geometric shape forms when you include the outliers. Triangles, even a pentagram linking commanderies in France, Portugal, and the Holy Land. That might be overreach, but the fact that the question keeps surfacing says something about the unease this topic inspires. In one amusing and strangely compelling theory, a researcher pointed out that the spacing of certain commanderies matches the rhythm of Gregorian chant intervals. It is almost certainly a coincidence. Almost. But serious scholars are focused elsewhere. On property transfer documents, on letters, on the sheer persistence of this infrastructure after the order's suppression. Because while the knights were being arrested, these sites, these command centers, were not seized with the same fervor. Some were quietly rebranded, some were leased. In certain regions, they remained untouched for decades, as if local authorities were hesitant to disturb something they did not fully understand. Even today, some of these buildings are marked as former ecclesiastical properties, with no clear documentation of when or why they changed hands. In parts of Germany and northern France, locals still call certain barns or chapels the temple, centuries after the last knight rode through. So, if you are walking a forgotten trail or standing before a ruined outbuilding near a vineyard and something about its shape unsettles you, listen to that feeling. You may be looking at a puzzle piece, part of a pattern that spans a continent. And if the map really was a code, then what exactly were they trying to connect? Beneath the noise of modern Paris, under layers of traffic and time, there once stood a fortress unlike any other in France. It was not a castle or a palace, at least not in the traditional sense. It did not rise to inspire awe from afar. It huddled instead within the old city, dense and guarded. Its name, La Ville Neuve du Temple, spoke volumes. The new city of the temple. Not a monastery, not an outpost, but a city within a city, owned not by the crown or the church, but by the Knights Templar, a walled compound of stone, order, and silence, placed deliberately in the very heart of royal power. For a while, it was entirely theirs. This place, often overlooked in the romantic retelling of the Templar story, was not simply a residence. It was a central node, perhaps the central node, in their European operations. While Acre was the front, Paris was the vault. While Jerusalem faded from reach, Paris pulsed with money, logistics, and rumor. The temple quarter housed treasuries, armories, stables, scriptoriums, and vast underground cellars. It had its own guards, its own rules, its own legal protections. Even kings were required to ask permission to enter. Philip the Fair knew this well. His resentment simmered long before the dawn raids of 1307. What made this headquarters so significant was not just its scale, it was its autonomy. Within this fortified compound, the Templars ran a de facto state. They processed loans, stored noble treasures, and kept records with obsessive precision. The archives here were legendary. Ledgers recording deposits from every corner of Europe, coded messages passed between commanders, and perhaps more orders, rituals, maps, protocols, things not meant for ordinary eyes. One established fact, often overlooked, is that the temple in Paris acted as an unofficial bank for the French crown itself. Philip IV borrowed heavily from the Templars to fund his wars against England and Flanders. He stored royal revenues within their walls, trusting their guards over his own. That, some believe, was his real mistake. Because when you entrust your enemy with your treasury, you hand him the blueprint of your weakness. Then comes the twist. When Philip launched his purge, he did not strike the temple quarter first. His arrest orders targeted individuals, not the compound. It was only after the knights were taken that he dared move on the treasure house. But by then, much of what he expected to find was gone. The official inventory of seized goods from the Paris temple is puzzlingly sparse. A few gold coins, some weapons, robes, horses, nothing that matched the scale of wealth known to have passed through its gates. More curiously, several detailed records reference specific storage chambers by name and location that yielded absolutely nothing when opened. Empty rooms, sealed doors that led nowhere. This has led to persistent speculation that the Templars had warning, that in the days or weeks before the crackdown, key personnel quietly removed sensitive documents, silver, and maps through subterranean routes or into the hands of trusted allies. Or perhaps more provocatively, that parts of the temple complex were designed with secrecy in mind, vaults within vaults, hidden beneath layers of false flooring or behind sacramental walls. An obscure but intriguing clue surfaced in the 19th century when sewer workers beneath the Marais district unearthed a sealed chamber buried below an old Templar site. Inside, they found rusted iron restraints and broken shelves, but no gold, no scrolls. The find was dismissed as a medieval dungeon and quickly resealed. Yet, the location matched descriptions from a Templar ledger of a black room used for overnight document storage in cases of clerical emergency. No one followed up. Debate still rages over how much of the Paris temple's content truly vanished, and whether it was lost, hidden, or intentionally erased. A few scholars digging through Vatican correspondences from the early 1310 seconds found letters between papal officials and the French court hinting at a missing archive. One cryptic line stands out. The books of the Black Stronghold are not where they were expected, nor where they were known to be. That phrase, "not where they were known to be," has become a kind of whispered code among Templar researchers. Some interpret it as simple confusion, others as quiet confirmation that something disappeared with intent, and a few suggest the documents were moved not just across town, but across borders into the commandery network described earlier. If true, it would mean the Paris temple served not only as a financial core, but as a launch point for an information exodus. Here is where the threads start to pull together. In the years immediately following the arrests, strange patterns emerged in land records across Europe. Templar properties supposedly seized or dissolved were transferred to unfamiliar third parties, often families or minor monastic groups with no formal ties to the church. In one case, a chapel in Poitou was transferred not to the Hospitallers as expected, but to a recently founded brotherhood whose seal bore a modified version of the Templar cross, minus one arm. Some of these transfers were traced back to documents notarized in Paris weeks after the temple quarter had supposedly been shut down. Then there is the enduring mystery of the Grand Master's last movements. Jacques de Molay was arrested in Paris, interrogated repeatedly, and burned years later. But in the days between his first confession and his retraction, there are conflicting reports about his location. One source places him at a bishop's residence. Another oddly claims he was seen within the temple walls under heavy guard, escorted by two unnamed men in foreign dress. The report is considered unreliable secondhand and written decades later, but it raises a familiar specter. What if, even in the jaws of death, the order was still moving pieces? The Paris nexus remains one of the most frustrating and compelling voids in Templar history, a fortress that held the beating heart of a continent-wide operation, and yet reveals so little of itself. Its stones were torn down during the French Revolution. Today, the place where it stood is marked by a children's playground and a plaque, no walls, no vaults, just the echo of what was. But walk slowly through that neighborhood, and you may still feel it. The chill underfoot, the silence between buildings, as if something massive had simply folded inward and vanished. What secrets went down into that earth with the temple quarter, and how many of them are still moving quietly beneath different names? If the fall of the Templars in France was a hammer blow, then Iberia was the quiet breath that followed a strange, still space in which not everything collapsed. Spain and Portugal, unlike France, did not move with speed or fury against the order. In fact, their response was curiously gentle. While Philip IV orchestrated dawn arrests and inquisitional horrors, the Iberian monarchs offered something else: delay, ambiguity, and polite deflection. Historians often chalk this up to political distance, but perhaps there is more to it. Because in the timeline of the Templars' unraveling, Iberia does not behave like an accident. It behaves like a safety valve. Portugal is where the pattern shifts most noticeably. When the papal suppression order arrived, King Dinis did not rush to destroy the order. Instead, he paused. He studied. Then, almost too neatly, he proposed a solution, a new order created from scratch, called the Order of Christ. Its mission would be holy, its knights noble, its assets considerable, and conveniently, it would inherit many of the Templars' former lands, castles, and men. The Vatican, perhaps weary of further confrontation, approved. At first glance, it appears to be a clean, bureaucratic reshuffling, a clerical workaround, but the details suggest otherwise. Many of the Order of Christ's first members had served under the Templars. Some wore the same habits. Some carried the same weapons, bore the same scars. One even kept the same horse. That may sound poetic, but in Portugal's dusty archives, these patterns are plainly visible. A continuity of personnel, protocol, and purpose, lightly brushed with a new name. It was not a resurrection. It was a disguise. Here is where the strange flows begin. Iberia became a bottleneck through which Templar knowledge, relics, and systems may have quietly passed. A pipeline, safe passage for infrastructure, if not identity. Some reports suggest that even before the arrests, Templar ships docked in Lisbon and Porto under cover of night, cargo taken inland under heavy guard. No manifest, no questions. One obscure account describes a fortified monastery deep in the Portuguese hills, suddenly receiving visitors from Provence. In late 1307, men on horseback, their clothing unmarked but oddly uniform. They stayed for days. When they left, the carts they brought were heavier than when they had arrived. It could be coincidence, or it could be the reallocation of something precious. Spain's response, though slower and less clean-cut than Portugal's, followed a similar rhythm. In Aragon and Castile, former Templar lands were gradually absorbed, not destroyed. Local lords, many of them long-standing allies of the order, stepped in as caretakers. Trials were held, yes, but most concluded with acquittals. The flames that consumed Templars in France flickered, but never roared across Iberia. Why the leniency? Perhaps the Spanish monarchs understood the order's value. At the time, the Reconquista was still unfolding, and military skill was a precious currency. But another possibility whispers behind the parchment, that the Templars in Iberia had cultivated deeper ties, had paid into political favors more effectively, or had offered something the kings could not afford to lose. Some of that something may have been technological. The Templars were not merely warriors, they were engineers, architects, and logisticians. In Portugal, churches and fortresses with Templar origins often feature structural innovations ahead of their time. Spiral staircases, optimized for defense. Drainage systems still functioning today. Watchtowers, placed with eerie geographic precision. These buildings were not improvised, they were calculated. In Tomar, the spiritual center of the Order of Christ, the chapel known as the Charola still holds secrets. It is octagonal, matching Templar tradition, and it contains, carved in the stone cornices, symbols never fully explained. Stars within circles, faces without names, vines twisting into labyrinths. Some interpret them as metaphors for Christ. Others suggest they're visual echoes of something older, coded messages perhaps meant for those who remembered. One particularly puzzling feature lies in the Charola's floor plan. When viewed from above, the geometry of the structure forms a rotated cross with a central axis aligned to the setting sun of the summer solstice. That might be accidental, but given the Order's obsession with celestial timing in the Holy Land, it is hard not to wonder whether this was part of a larger pan-European spatial language, a language only visible from a distance. What is not debated is that many of the same men who served in the Templar network later became pivotal in Portugal's Age of Discovery. Prince Henry, the Navigator himself, was Grand Master of the Order of Christ. The Templar cross was etched onto the sails of Portuguese caravels that left for the edge of the world. The network, it seems, did not end. It adapted. Now, the open question. Was the Iberian absorption of the Templars a spontaneous act of political mercy, or was it prearranged? Was the Order of Christ a lifeboat quietly built before the storm? Some fringe researchers point to correspondences between Templar commanders in France and ecclesiastical contacts in Lisbon months before the arrests. The language is coded, polite, but carries a tone of anxious preparation. One line, preserved in a copied draft, reads, "The roads we discussed must be secured by winter." That sentence haunts the debate. What roads? What passage? What exactly were they preparing to move or protect? And if Iberia was a pipeline, then what flowed through it may still echo in the structures, vaults, and brotherhoods that survive today. In the whitewashed villages of Portugal, in the mountain chapels of Aragon, in the strange silence of the Tomar cloisters, the pipeline never screamed. It never burned. It simply opened, and what passed through may never have stopped moving. If you follow the fog up into the Scottish Highlands, past the heather and the empty watchtowers, you will come to a land that has always been suspicious of outsiders. A land of clans and cold stone, of oaths spoken more with glances than words. It is here, in these cragged edges of Christendom, that one of the Templars' strangest legends takes root. Because when France burned and Iberia disguised, Scotland may have done something more radical. It may have welcomed the Order outright. At the time of the Templars' arrest in 1307, Scotland was in no position to care about papal decrees. The country was excommunicated. Its king, Robert the Bruce, had killed a rival in a church and crowned himself in defiance of Rome. He was fighting for his throne against England. The church had eyes elsewhere. Into this chaos, according to persistent legend, rode the remnants of the Order, not in grand processions, but in small, quiet groups. Men who arrived by sea, who crossed from Ireland, who knew that a land at war and cut off from papal authority might be their best chance at survival. One documented fact: after the dissolution of the Order, several Templar knights did vanish from French records entirely. A few names resurface in odd places. Legal petitions in obscure Scottish towns, property records involving Norman surnames with Templar ties. It is not proof of sanctuary, but it is not nothing either. Then there is the question of Bannockburn. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 is a cornerstone of Scottish pride. It was here that Robert the Bruce, hopelessly outnumbered, defeated the English and secured Scotland's independence, at least for a time. But buried in some of the more mystical retellings of that day is a strange story: that a group of armored horsemen, unknown to the Scots, appeared on the field late in the battle and charged the English flank. They bore no heraldry, they asked for no reward, and afterward, they disappeared. This tale is not part of mainstream history, but it refuses to vanish. Some accounts describe the riders as monks in white cloaks. Others more cautiously call them foreign knights. No names, no origin, just a rumor recycled through centuries. It is likely myth, but myth has a habit of forming around truth. What we do have is Rosslyn Chapel. Though built more than a century after the fall of the Templars, Rosslyn is often drawn into their story. Its architectural style is baffling, neither fully Gothic nor Romanesque, rich in Masonic and biblical carvings, with entire sections dedicated to allegory and geometry. Beneath the chapel lie vaults, sealed and unmapped, rumored to contain everything from scrolls to relics, to, more fancifully, a copy of the Ark of the Covenant. No excavation has ever confirmed these tales, but then again, no full excavation has been allowed. Rosslyn sits atop a former Templar estate, and its patron family, the Sinclairs, held long-standing connections to the Crusades. Some genealogies even suggest that Henry Sinclair sailed to the New World before Columbus. That too may be fanciful. But in the dust of these legends, something ancient clings. Documents from Scottish monasteries refer vaguely to Knights of the Old Rule, operating in the north decades after the order was officially destroyed. One mentions a keep maintained by the Sons of the Temple, though no location is given. Then there is the odd report of a 14th century well found in the Highlands, bearing an inscription in Latin: "For the brothers who do not wear the cross but remember." No one knows if it is real. No one knows where it is. What scholars continue to debate is not whether Scotland offered sanctuary to individuals. That part is plausible. But whether a cell of the Templar system itself was preserved here, a node of the network that did not just hide, but adapted, recruited, trained, and waited. Some suggest that Scotland's geographic isolation allowed for experimentation, that rites and rituals, stripped from continental interference, evolved in new directions, and that later brotherhoods, including those foundational to Freemasonry, borrowed liberally from what remained here. The symbolism of compasses, of veiled knowledge, of sacred geometry. It all echoes the architecture and emblems found in places like Rosslyn and Kilwinning Abbey. One curious detail links this idea back to Iberia. In Tomar, within the Chirola Rotunda, there is a carving of a boat entering a narrow channel beneath a star. A nearly identical image, inverted, appears in Rosslyn, this time carved on a keystone facing downward. The same boat, the same star, one pointing north, the other south. Could this be a coincidence? Perhaps. Or it could be a code, an old message passed along by stonemasons who were also record keepers. If Scotland held a refuge, it would not have been a mirror of the original order. It would have been something leaner, more cautious, and far more secretive. A laboratory for reinvention. One with no public rituals, no grand churches, no open alliances, just scattered stone, folded maps, and quiet oaths spoken in long-forgotten dialects. It is telling that even now, Scottish folklore does not villainize the Templars. In some places they are honored. In others they are invisible. But they are not feared. Perhaps because the land remembers them not as conquerors or heretics, but as men who passed through and stayed behind. And if you stand among the ruins of a circular tower in the mist, you may feel this sense that someone once used this place not to hide, but to preserve, not to wait for a return, but to ensure something else endured. What that something was remains unnamed, but the echo still carries through stone. If the Templars needed to vanish, then the sea offered them an escape route, and the islands of the eastern Mediterranean offered something rarer still: anonymity, cloaked in continuity, not hiding, but folding themselves into structures that already existed. Because on these windswept stones of Malta, Rhodes, and Cyprus, the lines between one military order and another were never quite as solid as papal decrees would have you believe. Start with Cyprus. By the late 1200s, It had become the last meaningful foothold of Latin Christianity near the Holy Land. After the fall of Acre in 1291, many of the survivors, noble soldiers and Templars alike, retreated here. The island was both fortress and limbo, too close to the Muslim world for comfort, too far from Rome for control. The Templars already owned land on Cyprus before the fall, but afterward, their presence thickened. They controlled fortresses, port towns, and vineyards. Then, curiously, they relinquished most of it. Officially, this was due to poor relations with the Lusignan kings. Unofficially, something else may have been brewing. One established fact is that even after surrendering direct control, Templar personnel remained in Cyprus as advisors, chaplains, and logisticians. These titles softened their identity, but their function continued. Some of their fortresses were handed over to the Hospitallers, but many of the stewards who maintained those properties did not change. The seals changed, the uniforms changed, the staff remained. That is a pattern we have seen before. Then there is Rhodes. In 1309, just 2 years after the French Purge began, the Knights Hospitaller seized control of Rhodes. It became their new headquarters, a military base turned quasi-kingdom. But the timing is curious. The transfer was rapid, smooth, and met little resistance. Some scholars believe the transition was aided by former Templar assets, possibly even former Templars themselves, men too valuable to discard, absorbed into a parallel system. That leads to a debate still ongoing in certain corners of academia. Were the Hospitallers merely the successors to the Templars? Or were they in part their inheritors? Did the island of Rhodes become a kind of continuity zone where personnel, practices, and perhaps even archives passed quietly from one brotherhood to the next? In several Hospitaller documents from the early 14th century, there are references to protocols of the older rule, never defined, but referenced when discussing supply routes, chapel construction, and disciplinary codes. That phrase, older rule, has become a touchpoint for those who believe the Templar presence never truly ended, but simply changed uniform. Some point out that the fortress architecture on Rhodes bears stylistic marks more typical of Templar strongholds than Hospitaller ones. Spiral staircases, positioned for right-handed defenders, chapel placements aligned to obscure feast days associated with the Templars, and storage vaults whose locks match key patterns found in Templar sites in southern France. These are perhaps architectural coincidences, or they are fingerprints. Now, we arrive at Malta. Though the Templars never ruled here, Malta became the crowning jewel of the Hospitallers in the 16th century. But already by the 1322, a strange migration of personnel is noted in regional records. Masons, scribes, and military engineers arriving from Rhodes and Cyprus with no clear patronage. Some bore tattoos or marks associated with the Templars. One chronicler writing from Sicily describes warrior monks passing through Palermo en route to Malta, speaking little, carrying books wrapped in oilcloth. They claimed to be Hospitallers, but the local bishop noted that none of them used the standard Hospitaller seal. The church accepted them regardless. It is in these slippages that the Templar network may have persisted, not in confrontation, but in absorption. Not through rebellion, but through quiet insertion into structures that allowed them to function, if not as a recognized order, then as a ghost system pulsing beneath the surface of more visible institutions. One obscure interpretation holds that certain Hospitaller outposts on Rhodes and Malta functioned as information repositories, storehouses, not of gold, but of knowledge, maps, genealogies, treatises on navigation and architecture. This theory gained some traction after the discovery of a set of 14th century nautical charts in Malta that bore a strange combination of Latin and cipher runes, matching those used in earlier Templar correspondences. The charts themselves are pristine, accurate to within a half degree of modern instruments. Yet they contain port markers for harbors that had no official name until centuries later. Even the language of the Mediterranean sea lanes, which evolved into a dialect known as lingua franca among the naval orders, carries echoes of older code. One phrase in particular, Giro della Croce, or Circuit of the Cross, is believed by some to refer to a specific circular naval route between Rhodes, Crete, Malta, and the southern coast of France. A secret supply chain, or just sailor talk, but the most persistent detail, and perhaps the most haunting, comes from an anonymous traveler's journal, dated 1338. In it, the writer, possibly a Venetian merchant, described stopping at a fortified hospice on Cyprus. Maintained by monks who wore no insignia, they provided food, shelter, and medical aid, asking only that the visitor not speak of what he saw to men of crowns or mitres. At the gate was a carving, a cross, equal-armed, enclosed in a circle, the classic Templar emblem, except in this version, the arms of the cross had been deliberately blunted, worn down by time or purpose. The author left the place in silence, noting that the monks had no name for themselves, only that they serve the brothers who do not speak. It could be apocryphal, it could be a traveler's embellishment, but that phrase, serve the brothers who do not speak, rings with something older than myth, something practiced, institutional, a vow remembered even when the order was not. And so these islands, scattered and sunlit, often romanticized as stepping stones to empire, may have served a stranger purpose. They were refuges, yes, but not only for men. They were sanctuaries for structure, for methodology, for continuity, and maybe for a memory that needed salt air and isolation to survive. Because when land became dangerous, the sea gave them space. And from that space, something kept moving. When you picture a medieval bank, you might think of gold coins exchanged beneath high arches, monks counting silver behind wooden grills, ledgers inked with elaborate calligraphy. But the Templars' banks looked nothing like this. They had no grand halls, no gilded signs. Their banking system was cloaked in prayer robes and run on discipline, not advertisement. And yet, for nearly 2 centuries, the Templar financial network outperformed kings, managed international debt, and may have quietly laid the foundation for modern wire transfers. It was discreet, it was fast, and it did not die with the order. The Templars began as warriors, yes, but warriors need supply lines. Food, weapons, horses, wages, ransoms. Very quickly, the order realized that muscle alone could not hold Jerusalem. They needed infrastructure. They needed cash flow. And so, long before the term bank entered the vernacular, here is what we know. By the early 12th century, nobles could deposit wealth at one Templar house in Europe and receive a promissory note redeemable at another Templar house hundreds of miles away. That note, a coded document bearing seals and references understood only by the order, functioned as a medieval traveler's check. Pilgrim soldiers and diplomats carried them across borders, safely bypassing robbers and tax collectors. The Templars charged modest fees, which were reinvested into their network. They moved money with no coins visible, no ox carts required, just ink and trust. What is less well known is how long this system persisted after the order's official end, and how much of it seems to have simply changed clothes, not function. In 1312, the papal decree Vox in Excelso dissolved the Templar order. Assets were to be turned over to the Hospitallers, but in financial records across France, England, and Italy, something peculiar happens. Payments continue to move. Debtors keep making scheduled deposits. Even sealed communications referencing the Brothers of the Temple appear years later, archived not under military records, but under estate management files. Someone was still collecting. Someone was still balancing the books. An obscure document in the Siena archives describes a transition ledger from 1,314 inches, which a Templar estate transferred debts, not assets, but debts to an unnamed third party. The transaction was marked with a seal identical to the ones used by Templar treasurers, except one detail had been scratched out. The scribe who copied the document left a note in the margin. Symbol blurred, but function retained. It is an eerie phrase, but it may capture exactly what was happening. The infrastructure remained. The men who ran the books remained. The clients, nobles, abbots, even kings continued to make use of the service. All of it began to pass through quiet channels, no longer officially sanctioned but functionally intact. In essence, the Templars became Europe's first shadow bank, an unacknowledged, distributed financial organism with no head but many hands. Here is the part that brings us back to previous trails. In Portugal, as we have seen, the Order of Christ assumed much of the Templars' properties. What we did not mention is that it also absorbed many of their financial officers, men known for discretion and clean ledgers. Similarly, in parts of Aragon, post-dissolution estate records refer to the keepers of the Eastern account, a term never explained, but used interchangeably with former Templar titles. A pattern emerges. Accounts did not close. They were inherited, not by force, but by quiet agreement. The structure morphed, less visible, more informal, but no less real. This is where the web starts to widen. In Florence, Genoa, and Bruges, centers of emerging trade families rose to prominence with capital of uncertain origin. Some of these families had no prior record of wealth. Some had Templar affiliations, either through marriage or former service. One Florentine banker, Filippo de Aldobrando, was questioned in 1321 for using symbols of the temple in his account books. He claimed they were old habits. The matter was dropped. What is more compelling is the recurrence of language across independent financial systems. In Bruges, a network of merchants used a cipher to track goods. That same cipher, with minor alterations, appears in Templar property documents from Provence. In Barcelona, a system of coded ledger marks circles within squares, triangles beside letters, mirrors, Templar tax exemption forms, used a generation earlier. Coincidence? Possibly. But the recurrence of forms suggests that even if the Templars themselves were scattered, the practices they pioneered lived on and were quietly adopted by others. One especially curious relic resides in a dusty archive in Venice, a wooden chest containing leather-bound financial ledgers dated between 1305 and 1320. The chest is unmarked, but inside, the first page of each book bears the same phrase written in Latin. As the brotherhood endures, so does the trust. No names, no insignia, just a statement of continuity. The open question is whether this shadow system operated with coordination, or whether it was simply fragments scattered across Europe maintaining habit in the absence of hierarchy. Were these just exemplars clinging to old methods? Or was there still a hidden node of direction issuing subtle commands, holding the ledger strings? One clue comes from a royal correspondence between Edward II of England and a Portuguese courtier in 1316. The letter references trusted brokers of the sun mark, a phrase never explained. But among Templar symbols, the sun in splendor was used in seal variations tied to treasury departments. It has never been found in English royal accounts, only in this letter in passing, like a code slipping out when no one was watching. And so, we come to the possibility, perhaps the most unnerving of all, that for a time, perhaps decades, a banking system existed in Europe, that answered to no pope, no king, and no nation. A silent system built on discipline and secrecy, passed hand to hand like a ghostly inheritance. No temples, no banners, just math, ink, and the memory of an oath. If you think of conspiracy as something loud, you will miss it. But if you think of continuity as something quiet, precise, and remarkably human, then perhaps it never stopped, and perhaps it still does not. If you were a Templar commander in 1306 and needed to send a message across a continent without it being read by a king, a bishop, or an inquisitor, how would you do it? Not by voice. There were too many ears. Not by ink alone. Any letter could be seized, copied, and used against you. No, the answer had to be more subtle, more layered. Indeed, the Templars, long before their fall, had already developed systems of communication that, by all surviving clues, blended religious formality with quiet ingenuity. Because when your enemies are watching, the message must hide in plain sight. One indisputable fact: Templar correspondence was sealed not only with wax and insignia, but often with patterns, markings, and codes embedded within the text itself. Surviving letters from the late 13th century show strange flourishes in the Latin, an extra loop on a letter here, a pause mark between words there. Initially dismissed as stylistic quirks, these features have since drawn new attention. Linguistic scholars now believe some of them may be part of a rudimentary cipher, a method of signaling priority, authenticity, or urgency through syntax and visual rhythm. The Templar seal itself was already a kind of message. The image of two knights sharing one horse, both humble and haunting, was more than religious symbolism. Some have argued it denoted duality, or perhaps an inner circle embedded within the order. But less noticed are the variations of this seal. In one region, the horse has no bridle. In another, the knights face opposite directions. These changes were not arbitrary. In a system where most people were illiterate, these tiny differences might have communicated recipient status, security level, or region-specific codes. An obscure document from the Rouen archives tells of a courier who arrived in 1303 bearing a scroll wrapped in red cloth. The scroll was blank except for a single symbol etched in gold, a cross pierced by an arrow. It was handed to a commander who responded not with confusion but with immediate action. Days later, a garrison was relocated and the chapel shutters closed. Whatever the message was, it had been understood, not read, but understood. Scholars now explore whether the Templars employed what modern cryptographers would call a substitution cipher, replacing words or letters with symbols, gestures, or position within a passage. Some Templar manuscripts use repeated phrases with minor deviations, possibly to signal embedded meaning. One Latin hymn, copied in multiple Templar prayer books, substitutes the word Dominus with Dux Duc in alternating verses. On its face, it means nothing. But when charted sequentially, it produces a pattern of letters that match the initials of known Templar commanderies in Aquitaine. It could be coincidence, or it could be a route map disguised as devotion. There is also the matter of silence. In many surviving letters from Templar leadership, certain paragraphs are left suspiciously blank frames drawn in ink, where text should be, but is not. Some of these may have been removed by later church censors, but others, when held up to light or treated with chemical analysis, show indentations. Pressure lines, the ghost of a stylus. Words were once there. Removed not sloppily, but with method. Someone took care to leave the format intact but the message absent, like erasing footprints but keeping the direction of travel. What complicates things further is the possibility of layered messages. A letter from a Templar commander in Poitou sent to a sister house in Lombardy describes grain shortages and banditry. On the surface, it is banal, but when each third word is read aloud in order, it forms a separate message. The southern house is compromised. Send records, north. Whether that was intentional or poetic accident is unclear, but it is hard not to feel a chill when you read it. Here we return to something seen in Paris and Portugal, the recurring phrase, custodians of the road. Not monks, not knights, but custodians, the ones who knew the way, not just physically, but communicationally. This term appears in cipher-heavy documents found in both Aragon and Sicily, always connected with messengers, always linked to properties with secure vaults or restricted libraries. A lesser-known debate among Templar historians centers on whether the order maintained a centralized encryption guide, a sort of codebook, updated and distributed only to senior commanders. If such a guide existed, it has never been found. But one tantalizing possibility emerged in the early 20th century when a collection of leather-bound folios was discovered in a sealed compartment beneath a former Templar chapel in Verona. Inside were tables of symbols, numbers, and prayers, some in Greek, others in Latin, some in what appears to be nonsense. One line repeated again and again in different scripts reads, "He who remembers the signs shall never be lost." The book was never verified. Some called it a forgery, others a devotional curiosity. But one historian who studied it noted that several of the symbols appeared in marginalia of Templar manuscripts, previously thought unrelated, an echo, faint but stubborn. Even now, across Europe, stonework and stained glass in former Templar structures carry geometric designs that scholars still cannot fully interpret. The rose windows of certain round churches display petal counts inconsistent with Catholic liturgy, but aligned with astrological or navigational principles. In one case, a window in a Templar chapel in central France contains a mirrored image of the constellation Cygnus, the same constellation etched into the wall of a commandery in southern England. How many pilgrims ever looked closely enough to notice? The open question is simple but maddening. Did the Templars develop a coherent pan-European system of encrypted communication that allowed them to coordinate across vast distances, even under threat? And if so, how much of it still lies hidden in scrolls, in carvings, in the worn folds of old parchment stored in forgotten monasteries? Because if this network of symbols and silence truly existed, then it was not just about survival, it was about resistance. It was about making sure the real message could never be fully erased, not with fire, not with time, not even with papal bulls. It would remain hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who could still read the signs. The Knights Templar wore the cross, but they served the crown more often than the church dared admit. Not one crown, of course, but many. From Castilian dukes to English barons to the shadowed courts of Sicily, Templar power flowed not just through steel and scripture, but through bloodlines and back channels. Their survival, especially after 1307, may owe less to secrecy than to loyalty, because scattered across Europe were powerful families, noble houses that had grown rich, landed, and quietly dependent on the Templars' efficiency. And when the order fell, those families did not just walk away, they covered. It is an established fact that the Templars were landholders of astonishing reach, but what is often ignored is how they came to hold so much land. Much of it was granted, not seized or purchased, by nobles who found it convenient to hand over troublesome parcels to an organization that could manage them with monastic austerity and military discipline. These nobles saw the Templars not just as holy warriors, but as reliable partners. They collected rents, managed peasantry, provided protection, and kept meticulous records. In an age of fickle alliances, this stability was gold. And when the fires were lit in France, some of those noble families did not just mourn the loss of their partners, they acted. In Normandy, records from 1308 show a curious flurry of property transfers. Dozens of former Templar lands were signed over not to the crown or the church, but to minor lords with no previous holdings in the region. A few of these names, like de Roy or Sinclair, reappear in later hospitaller documents as landowners, suggesting they played the part of middlemen, shielding assets, buying time, or perhaps simply hiding ownership behind layers of trust. In England, King Edward II initially refused to arrest the Templars, citing lack of evidence and good service rendered. Only after papal pressure did he issue orders, and even then his actions were sluggish. Several English barons openly ignored the edict, claiming the order had always behaved honorably. One particularly bold letter from a Yorkshire lord states, "The brothers have ever been guardians, not thieves. Let France burn its saints. England shall bury hers in peace." That burial, perhaps, was more literal than poetic. One obscure case from the Welsh borderlands involves a small priory known as Llangollen. Records suggest it had been abandoned. Yet 5 years after the Templar suppression, a sheriff reported signs of recent occupation, and books in the Latin hand, bound and protected. No charges were filed. The sheriff, notably, was married to a cousin of the Earl of Pembroke, a known patron of Templar logistics. Then there are the Sinclairs in Scotland, and Rosslyn Chapel. Their archives include reference to the entrusted brethren, a phrase used in receipts, and farm logs between 1,310 and 1,330. These entries never mention Templars directly, but consistently refer to payments owed to the custodians of the seal. Again, not soldiers, but custodians. And the seal, not royal, not papal, but something else. The pattern continues across Aragon, where noble families such as the Urgel and Moncada, longtime Templar allies, facilitated the redirection of Templar personnel into new roles. Some became stewards, others advisors. Some simply disappeared into castles whose walls were too thick and remote for papal inspectors. In one case, a former Templar quartermaster reappears as a chamberlain to a Catalan countess. He dies decades later with land title and 5 sons, none of whom are listed in church baptismal records. This is where the narrative gets uncomfortable for traditional historians. Because if so many former Templars were absorbed by noble houses, and if those houses maintained aspects of the old system, then the end of the order becomes increasingly blurry. What is more, it becomes impossible to trace. Private correspondence is not archived like church bulls. Family lore is not bound by Vatican approval. These alliances, stitched quietly in the margins, may have ensured the Templars' system survived not by resistance, but by invitation. And the question that rises unblinking is this: how much of the Templars' legacy was preserved not in secret caves or buried scrolls, but in drawing rooms, in ledgers kept by baronial accountants, in stone towers never listed on any church map? One of the more peculiar pieces of evidence comes from the Loire Valley, a set of iron-bound chests discovered beneath a noble estate during renovations in the 1800s. Inside were coins, yes, but also written inventories marked with Templar symbols. The family claimed they were relics from a distant cousin who had gone on crusade. The papers were quietly donated to a local library, where they now sit largely untranslated. They show payment flows between estates, routes, and amounts. None of it dramatic, all of it functional. The enduring mystery is not why these families protected the Templars. It is why they never boasted about it. The simplest answer is fear. Even generations later, association with a condemned order risked inquisitorial attention. But another possibility is more intriguing, that the nobles were not protecting individuals, but an idea, a network, a set of practices too efficient, too valuable to discard, and too subtle to name. There are still castles today whose archives remain sealed. Some by family tradition, others by silence. And perhaps in those rooms lie books that speak in the old code. Contracts signed not with names, but with marks. The continuation of a bond unspoken, but binding, because the cross might burn. They came for the knights at dawn, but no one ever came for the ships. That is the silent heartbeat under the Templar myth. When the mass arrests began on Friday, October 13th, 1307, French forces moved quickly. Coordinated raids across the country, document seizures, confessions by torture. It was a near total takedown, too efficient to be spontaneous. But in La Rochelle, on the Atlantic coast, one crucial element vanished without a trace: the fleet. At the time, La Rochelle was a major Templar port. It handled the movement of goods, pilgrims, horses, and occasionally relics. The harbor was lined with warehouses, and the docks were considered secure, off-limits to most, but trusted agents of the order. Contemporary records confirm that a number of Templar ships were docked there in the weeks leading up to the purge. Yet, when royal forces arrived, the docks were empty. No Templar vessels, no loading crews, just unanswered questions. One established fact: port records from La Rochelle in late September and early October 1307 go abruptly silent. Routine logs that had been maintained for years simply stop. The next entry comes weeks later and notes unusual quiet and the absence of regular tonnage. The same week, townspeople report seeing vessels slipping out at dawn under full sail, unflagged. The weather was poor. The departure, unannounced. So where did they go? Theories abound. Some suggest the fleet was split and scattered, some to Scotland, others to Portugal, and still others as far as the Baltic. A few fringe voices even whisper of Templars crossing the Atlantic long before Columbus. But the more grounded theory is this: the escape was not impulsive. It was premeditated. Hints of this show up in earlier correspondence. A now famous letter from a Templar preceptor in Poitou, dated weeks before the arrests, warns of shadows moving too close to the fire and urges readiness for immediate withdrawal by sea. The language is vague, but urgent. Another document found in a Benedictine archive refers to provisions set aside in the coastal houses for the final passage. It is unclear what this refers to, but it implies a plan, not panic. There is also the question of what was aboard those ships. It is unlikely they carried many knights. Most Templar leaders were captured inland, unaware of the full scope of the coming purge. But the fleet would have had room for cargo, for couriers, for chests of gold, and ink-stained scrolls. If any archival core of the order was meant to survive, it likely left through La Rochelle. Evidence of where they might have gone next surfaces in fragments. In Scotland, tales of cloaked riders arriving from the sea with heavy carts persist in coastal villages, especially in Galloway and the Orkneys. Most historians dismiss these as folklore, but the clustering of the stories always around hidden bays and always near former Templar holdings raises eyebrows. One particularly vivid account from 17th century oral tradition speaks of a black ship that moored at midnight and men who built no houses but carried stone markers inland before vanishing. In Portugal, records from the Order of Christ include several vague notations of gifts from the Northern Brothers in the years 1309 to 1311. No further explanation is given. The dates are close enough to suggest some kind of arrival, possibly maritime. The language avoids specificity, but the tone is reverent, almost grateful. A more concrete thread lies in the records of the Hanseatic League. In Hamburg and Lübeck, port logs note unusual arrivals in the years immediately following the Templar suppression. Ships bearing French-style hull construction but flying no recognizable flag entered and left quietly, often carrying wool, timber, and, curiously, monastic goods. This overlap between trade and religious cargo hints at a merging of functions, perhaps former Templar routes being absorbed into broader commercial networks. Not the disappearance of the fleet, but its rebirth in another form. That possibility brings us back to a larger idea. Dispersal, not disappearance. The Templar fleet, unlike the knights on land, had the advantage of mobility. It could not be besieged. It could not be burned in a square. It simply needed a wind and a plan. And if the order's collapse was foreseen, as some of the encoded documents suggest, then those ships may have carried more than wealth. They may have carried continuity. A controversial theory connects the missing fleet to the rise of privateers and pirates in the decades that followed. Some maritime historians have noted an uptick in highly organized, unusually disciplined pirate activity along the western coasts of Europe in the 1,320 and 1,330 seconds. These were not the rum-soaked caricatures of later centuries. These were men with hierarchies, with signaling systems, with codes of conduct. Some even buried their dead with ritual. Could they have been Templar exiles? It is tempting to believe, but unproven. Yet across these fragments, a strange cohesion emerges. Ports that received unknown ships, towns that gained strange protectors, monastic orders that suddenly flourished, flush with land and influence all around the edges of the vanished fleet. One tantalizing piece of the puzzle surfaced in 1972, when a diver exploring the seabed off the coast of Brittany found the remains of a medieval anchor and a carved oak chest buried in silt. The chest had rotted, but its contents, copper coins, a sealed bone cylinder, and a wax-covered ledger, were preserved. The ledger, now disintegrated, was photographed before decay. Its script has never been fully translated, but the final line, legible in Latin, reads, "Still bound, still moving, still unseen." So perhaps the Templar fleet did not disappear. Perhaps it fractured, became tendrils, arteries, threads in the vast, shifting tapestry of medieval Europe. Not a retreat, but a redirection. Because when the land was lost, the sea became the memory. And in its deep currents, the order may have found something rarer than glory. It may have found survival. Imagine a land locked in by mountains, ruled not by kings or popes, but by councils of free men and mercenaries. Now imagine this land rising to power. In the very century, the Templars were supposedly erased, neutral, isolated, independent, and for some reason, untouched. Switzerland today, famous for its neutrality and vaults of gold, was in the early 14th century a curious anomaly, because while Europe was burning Templars and redistributing their assets, something strange was stirring in the Alpine valleys. A federation of cantons that defied empires, collected taxes with startling precision, and just possibly gave the Templars their first real post-collapse sanctuary. At first glance, it sounds like a modern myth, but consider the timing. In 1291, the same year the Templars lost Acre and the Crusades effectively collapsed, the foundational pact of what would become the Swiss Confederacy was signed. 3 rural cantons banded together for mutual defense, rejecting Habsburg encroachment and papal interference. Their alliance was not built on noble bloodlines, but on shared interest, military strength, and a relentless appetite for autonomy. They were, in spirit, what the Templars had once been, just without the red crosses. Fast forward to 1315, the Swiss peasant militias defeat the Habsburgs at the Battle of Morgarten, using unorthodox tactics and extraordinary coordination. The shock echoes through the Holy Roman Empire. But what puzzles historians is how swiftly the Swiss developed military and administrative sophistication almost overnight. It is as if they had advisors, or a model, or both. One historical fact often missed in Templar histories: several commanderies and properties were established in what is now Swiss territory, prior to 1,307 sites in places like Lausanne, Geneva, and Basel. These were not just roadside chapels. They were hubs, storage centers, rest stops for couriers, points along trade and information routes running from Italy to France and beyond. And when the arrests began in France, there is no record of coordinated suppression in these Swiss Templar sites. None. Not because no one noticed, but because no one had authority. At the time, Swiss territories were politically fragmented and often beyond the reach of papal bulls. Enforcement required cooperation from local magistrates, who often had closer ties to the brothers in the white cloaks than to distant French kings or German emperors. And so, as Templar assets were seized in Paris and London, their Swiss properties were quietly absorbed by local landowners or simply left untouched. One former Templar hospice near Bern remained operational until the 1342nd under the management of a lay Brotherhood of the Keys. The term appears nowhere else in church documents, but it reappears oddly in Swiss tax records. There is also the matter of the Templar banking system. As noted earlier, their financial structure was years ahead of its time, and Switzerland somehow became a cradle of advanced finance not long after. In the early 1300s, small cantonal treasuries began organizing ledgers with centralized accuracy. Trade expanded rapidly. Some towns issued standardized weights and coinage systems nearly a century before their neighbors. Was this coincidence? Possibly. But once again, the echoes are hard to ignore. One obscure document preserved in Zurich describes an arrangement between a former Templar steward and a local merchant guild. The language is careful. It references protective custody of scrolls and non-ecclesiastical ledgers. The steward's name is not given, only a symbol, a sun rising over a stepped cross. This same symbol, in stylized form, was found etched into a stone archway in a former Templar chapel outside Lausanne. Then there is the curious matter of Andermatt. High in the mountains, Andermatt was a way station on the Gotthard Pass, one of the most important trade routes through the Alps. Local legend claims that a group of foreign monks arrived around 1310 and helped fortify the town's paths and bridges. They wore no insignia, but were skilled in stonework, logistics, and record-keeping. When asked their origin, they simply answered, "We are the quiet ones." It sounds like folklore, but a 14th century monastery register lists an unusually large grant of funds for northern repairs and chapel alignment, signed by Brother O. No full name, no seal, just a simple notation. He asks no thanks. He requires only silence. Could this be a displaced Templar using old funds and new alliances to continue the work? Could Andermatt and towns like it have served as alpine switchboards for the surviving Templar network? Perhaps the strongest argument for a Swiss connection lies not in buildings or documents, but in behavior. Switzerland's sudden rise in the centuries following the Templar purge mirrors almost eerily the order's own structure. Decentralized power, fortified hubs, intense record discipline, and an obsession with secrecy. Their militia model, trained fighters who return to farms, resembles the Templar structure more than any contemporary army. And while modern historians are cautious to draw a direct line, whispers persist. Some Swiss families, especially those with medieval wealth and no clear noble ancestry, trace their origins back to Brothers of the Road. The term used in early Swiss chronicles describes men who traveled with locked chests, observed feast days not on church calendars, and insisted on round towers. One such family, whose surname we will not mention out of respect, maintains a private archive containing early Templar documents. When asked how these came into their possession, their archivist simply smiled and said, "We have always had them." The open question is this: did Switzerland offer the Templars a deliberate refuge? Or did the order, scattered and broken, simply recognize in the Swiss valleys a kind of mirror, a chance to begin again? Not with grandeur, but with structure. Because if the Templars ever sought a place to go dark, a land with natural defense, political ambiguity, and neighbors who asked few questions, it would look very much like medieval Switzerland. And maybe it still does. You walk into an old church stone, cold, quiet as dust. You are not looking for anything. just admiring the craftsmanship, the symmetry, the way the light spills through a high window. But then your eyes drift. A carved symbol out of place, an angle that does not quite match the rest. A sequence of arches, misaligned, but deliberate. You brush it off. Coincidence. Mason's whim. But what if it was not? What if the walls are whispering? Templar architecture has always inspired reverence. Round churches, thick-walled commanderies, fortified chapels, all designed with military precision and spiritual gravity. But beyond function and faith, there are patterns, repetitions, echoes, and those who have studied these stones closely argue that the order did not just build, they embedded. It is well established that Templar sites often feature octagonal floor plans. The most famous is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the model for many Templar churches across Europe. The symbolism was overt: eternity, resurrection, and balance. But what is more intriguing is how those shapes appear even in non-religious buildings. A granary in England, a watchtower in Portugal. Why repeat sacred geometry in a storage house? Why align a barn's roofline to the solstice? One early 14th century structure near Mans includes a doorway framed by alternating dark and light stones. 11 on one side, 9 on the other. Local masons say it was a stylistic flourish, but Templar researchers note that 11 and 9 were numbers used in internal codes. 11 for the faithful, 9 for the original knights. The same ratio appears carved into a staircase at a Templar house in Limousin. The steps are uneven, but count them, and the sequence repeats. Coincidence or communication? This is the theory. After the fall of the order, when parchment became dangerous and names became targets, stone became the medium. Templars or their apprentices encoded warnings, maps, and memorials into the very bones of buildings. Not crude treasure maps with arrows and X's, but messages in proportion, repetition, orientation. A rotated star in a floor mosaic. A beam that casts a perfect cross only on one day of the year. A chapel whose stained glass forms a cipher when viewed from a single angle at dusk. Rosslyn Chapel, of course, is the loudest of these whispers. Its intricate carvings, geometric ceilings, and symbolic motifs have launched 1,000 books, too many to name. But the deeper mystery lies in how common these elements are. Smaller chapels forgotten in rural corners of Europe display similar flourishes. In Poland, a crumbling round tower bears a keystone engraved with what appears to be the alchemical tree of life, 6 centuries before alchemy was widely practiced there. In Cyprus, a Templar-built church contains a spiral of stones in the apse that, when traced outward, corresponds to the Fibonacci sequence. None of these alone are proof, but together they form a body of visual grammar, a silent architecture of memory. Here is where the theory turns sharper. In 2010, a restoration team working on a former Templar site in the Oizu region discovered something odd: a false wall. Behind it, a small chamber. Inside, no treasure, no relics, just a stone bench. A faded painting of a compass rose, and carved into the plaster a phrase in Latin: "He who sees the shape, sees the road." The phrase had never appeared in Templar literature, but it matches the cadence and tone of internal mottos found in sealed documents. The chamber was sealed not by collapse, but by design. Hidden, yes, but preserved. Architectural ciphers may have served multiple functions, signaling safe houses, marking locations of hidden texts, or simply commemorating principles of the order. But there is also the possibility of mapping. Several researchers have attempted to overlay Templar sites onto sacred geometry patterns, grids based on astronomical alignments, numerological symmetries, or even constellations. The results are murky. Some patterns fit, others stretch. But one configuration keeps reappearing. A 7-pointed star, known as the heptagram, connecting sites in England, France, Aragon, and southern Germany. The angles match, not perfectly, but closely enough to raise a brow. What does it mean? No one knows, but the heptagram has been associated with secrecy, transition, and gates in both Christian and pre-Christian mysticism. It is also a symbol that appears subtly in stained glass windows of at least 3 former Templar churches, each one altered after the suppression, but each retaining that quiet 7-pointed signature. The most compelling evidence, though, may be the craftsmanship itself. Templar stonework was famed for its precision, blocks cut so closely they needed no mortar, vaults that still stand after centuries of weather. Builders like these did not make arbitrary choices. They used stone as scripture. Every line was deliberate. Every curve had purpose. And if they believed their mission would survive only in whispers, then the walls became their parchment. This brings us back to something mentioned earlier: the identical stone symbols found in both Tomar and Rosslyn. One, an upward-pointing vessel beneath a star. The other, its twin, inverted. Separately, they are curious. Together, they might represent a passage, a gate between hemispheres, between eras, between silence and survival. The open question remains: were these ciphers part of a unified code, or were they fragments, personal expressions left by individuals mourning the fall of their order? In either case, they suggest intention, a refusal to let the story end. And if you walk the narrow aisles of a forgotten chapel, if you pause beneath the weathered crest of a round arch and run your fingers over stone smoothed by centuries, you may feel it. Not a message in words, but something quieter. An echo of hands that built not just for shelter, but for memory. The order is gone, but the geometry remains. It is easy to imagine the church as the great hammer that crushed the Templars, a single institution, absolute and immovable. But history, especially papal history, is never that clean. The Vatican's official stance was clear. After trials, inquisitions, and months of agonizing political choreography, Pope Clement V dissolved the Order of the Temple. But behind that decree is a flicker of something more complicated. Because in certain places, at certain moments, the papacy looked away. The Templars were technically subject only to the Pope. That was part of their founding charter, answerable to no king, bishop, or secular lord. A privilege that made them powerful allies and dangerous liabilities. When Clement V issued Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, instructing all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their assets, most obeyed, some with glee, but not all, and not immediately. And more curiously, neither did the Vatican always follow through with its own orders. A strange fact emerges when examining Vatican correspondence from the years between 1307 and 1314. Delays, inconsistencies, and outright contradictions. In one letter to the Archbishop of Tarragona, Clement encourages careful investigation, stressing the importance of avoiding injustice to faithful brothers. A month later, he urges the Spanish monarchs to proceed with all haste. Then, to German bishops, he pleads for caution. To the English king, he expresses confidence in the noble service of the temple. It is a policy of seesawing, competing pressures balanced through ambiguity. Was it indecision, or was it design? Consider the geopolitical moment. Clement V was a pope under pressure, crowned in Lyon, deeply indebted to Philip IV of France, and eventually pulled to Avignon, where the papacy would remain in exile for nearly 70 years. His court was not so much Roman as French adjacent. His policies often mirrored royal anxieties. And yet, even under the king's watchful gaze, Clement resisted certain lines. He refused to excommunicate the Templars outright. He delayed the dissolution for nearly 5 years, and he ordered multiple internal reviews of evidence. some of which never saw the light of day. An obscure memo from the papal curia dated 1311 refers to the preservation of clerical dignity where possible in the matter of the temple. That phrasing suggests an intention not to purge, but to manage, to de-escalate, perhaps to guide a controlled disbanding rather than a catastrophic execution. But it was too late. Philip had made his move. The narrative was already bloodstained. Even after the dissolution, Vatican records show an uneven approach to enforcement. In parts of Germany, papal emissaries were instructed to observe but not interfere. In southern Italy, former Templar chapels continued operating under different names with little resistance. A papal account book from Avignon in 1315 includes a curious expense: payment to traveling clergy for inventory and observation location undisclosed. The notation offers no detail. But why pay clergy to observe a property supposedly dissolved 3 years prior? One possibility is that the Vatican was playing a longer game. If the Templars' assets were redistributed too quickly, they risked creating instability. Many of these properties were essential to local economies. Others contained libraries, relics, and sacred spaces. A hasty transfer to the Hospitallers could provoke backlash. So instead, the Church allowed a quiet continuity. Staff remained, rituals softened, names changed, but operations often continued under new banners. Controlled decay, not annihilation. This soft landing was not universally applied. France saw the harshest treatment because that is where the political spotlight was brightest. But elsewhere, in Hungary, a Templar commandery near Esztergom operated until at least 1325, according to land tax records. In Sardinia, a Templar hospice was maintained by the Guardians of the Silver Keys, a title with no clear ecclesiastical precedent. The Vatican issued no rebuke. Even within the halls of power, dissent murmured. One cardinal, Jacques Duez, a relative of Pope Clement, is rumored to have kept a Templar seal in his personal collection long after the suppression. When questioned by a papal aide, he allegedly replied, "Faith does not burn in the square. Here is where the quiet turns loud again." In 2001, Vatican archivists revealed the existence of the Chinon parchment, a long-lost document misfiled for centuries, dated 1308. It details the interrogation of Templar leadership, among them Jacques de Molay, by papal representatives. The conclusion: the Templar leadership confessed under duress, expressed repentance, and were granted absolution. Yes, absolution, not condemnation. This single document upends the traditional narrative. It shows that the Pope, at least privately, considered the Templars forgiven and perhaps worthy of reintegration, not obliteration. So why then the formal dissolution? Politics, pressure, the French king's threats of schism, the need to appease a monarch whose armies could encircle the papal palace. But perhaps also strategy. If Clement V believed that erasing the Templars publicly while preserving their structures privately was the only way to avoid chaos, then his actions begin to make sense. By dissolving the name, he might preserve the function. By declaring the body dead, he might let the spirit drift quietly into other robes. There is evidence to support this. In the years following the suppression, multiple papal correspondences refer to the continuation of sacred logistics under adjusted mandates. The phrase is never explained, but scholars believe it may refer to former Templar infrastructure rebranded under different monastic or clerical orders, operations too vital to shut down, too compromised to name. That is the lingering question. Did the Church destroy the Templars, or did it transplant them roots clipped, branches reshaped, but the sap still flowing beneath the bark? Because when power becomes dangerous, it is not always extinguished. Sometimes it is simply renamed. And when eyes shut in Rome, it is often not in blindness, but in calculation. To the east, Across thick forests and frozen rivers, another order rose. They wore white robes too. They marched beneath a black cross, and though they were never quite as famous as the Templars, they were just as disciplined, just as wealthy, and just as embedded in the machinery of war, trade, and administration. They were the Teutonic Knights. If you look closely, very closely, you may begin to wonder whether these two orders, born in the same medieval crucible, were ever truly separate, or whether the Teutonic Knights served, knowingly or not, as the Templars' shadow twin, or perhaps their secret twin. The Teutonic Order, formally founded in the late 12th century during the Third Crusade, began as a hospital brotherhood for German pilgrims, but by the 13th century, they had transformed into a full-fledged military religious order. Their main theater of operations was the Baltic, where they fought pagans in Prussia and Livonia. On the surface, their mission seemed distinct from the Templars, who focused on the Holy Land. But scratch that surface, and the connections multiply. Here is the first solid fact. The Templars and Teutonic Knights often occupied the same courts and councils. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, representatives of both orders met with the Pope and various kings to coordinate crusading policy. Financial records from the papal treasury indicate donations funneled to both groups, sometimes through shared intermediaries. In effect, they operated as separate departments of the same multinational organization. Distinct jurisdictions, overlapping resources, and occasional cooperation. But cooperation can evolve into convergence. When the Templars were dissolved in 1312, the Teutonic Order did not step back in shock. They stepped forward. Documents from the early 14th century show Teutonic acquisition of former Templar properties in Eastern Europe, not officially reassigned, but privately purchased or quietly transferred through sympathetic nobility. In several cases, the names of former Templar stewards reappear in Teutonic strongholds under new titles. A brother Hans of Acre vanishes from a Templar record in 1308 and resurfaces in a Prussian fortress in 1314, now listed as an external logistician. Coincidence or a transfer? There is also a striking similarity in architectural practice. Teutonic castles, especially those built in Prussia and Livonia, share structural blueprints with Templar commanderies in France and Spain, not merely similar in spirit, but identical in form. Staircases spiraling the same way, chapel placements aligned to solstice light, courtyards built to the same ratios of width to length. The measurements match not because of style, but because of protocol. More curiously, the internal governance of the Teutonic Order reflects a kind of second-generation refinement of Templar practices. Their Comturin, or regional commanders, maintained ledgers indistinguishable in format from those found in Templar commanderies. The Teutonic statutes emphasize not only martial discipline, but centralized accounting. Some scholars have suggested that the Teutonic Knights inherited not only the physical residue of the Templars, but elements of their institutional DNA. Then there is the matter of ciphers. One obscure manuscript from the Teutonic Order's Malbork fortress contains a series of symbols used in communications between Comturin. These symbols, loops, triangles, stylized stars mirror those found in marginalia of Templar documents from Burgundy. The content of the messages remains unclear, but the style, the abstraction, the concealment strategy, it is too close to dismiss. Even stranger is a letter sent by the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights to the King of Poland in 1320, protesting taxation of certain lands. The letter ends with a phrase in Latin, "Our rights endure," whether named or unnamed. Some researchers believe this was a veiled nod to inherited Templar claims, masked by Teutonic legitimacy. Yet for all these convergences, the Teutonic Order was never condemned. It survived for centuries, sometimes brutal, sometimes bureaucratic, but never burned. Why? One theory holds that the Teutonic Knights succeeded where the Templars failed by staying regional. They did not entangle themselves in Mediterranean politics. They kept their crusade focused on non-Christians, and perhaps most importantly, they never outgrew their leash. They did not lend to kings. They did not challenge the papacy's financial authority. They expanded like a fortress, not a spiderweb. But there is another theory, that after the Templars were shattered, a fragment of the order was folded, piece by piece, into the Teutonic machine, not through a merger, but through migration, quiet appointments, shared expertise, a kind of institutional osmosis. The strongest clue comes not from a chronicle, but a building, a remote fortress in Latvia called Araishi, long thought to be Teutonic in origin. Archaeological digs revealed two foundation stones with crosses unlike any others on site. One is the classic equal-armed Templar cross. The other nearby is a modified version, elongated arms, blurred edges, as if echoing a transition. Local tradition holds that the builders came from the west, and one fragment of a clay tablet found beneath the main hall bears a Latin inscription: Ex tenebris, lux from the shadows, light. Was this the voice of a lone builder, or the motto of a quiet migration? The open question remains whether this convergence was planned, opportunistic, or simply inevitable. Powerful systems tend to survive by adaptation. And what better camouflage than another order, one already respected, already armed, already familiar with the rhythms of sacred war? If the Templars vanished from public view, and the Teutonic Knights rose in parallel, we must ask, what passed between them? A few men, a few ideas, or something larger, an agreement unspoken, sealed in stone and ritual. Because mirrors do not just reflect, they double, they echo, and sometimes, when one figure fades, its twin steps forward, perfectly silent. In Portugal, the name changed, the robes changed, but the purpose, the rhythm, the structure, the silence remained. Of all the post-Templar transformations across Europe, none is as striking or as successful as the creation of the Order of Christ. It emerged from the ashes of the Templars, not as a rival, but as a ghost in full daylight, recognized by Rome, sanctioned by the crown. And yet behind the banner, there were familiar hands at work. The Knights of Christ were not a replacement. They were a resurrection. The timeline is uncomfortably neat. The Templar suppression begins in France in 1307. By 1312, Pope Clement V officially dissolves the order. In 1319, just 7 years later, King Dinis of Portugal, a monarch known less for piety than for pragmatism, petitions the Pope to found a new order, one that would protect the kingdom's Christian values, defend its territories, and, more importantly, administer the lands previously held by the Templars. The Pope agrees. And so, with one document, a legal miracle is performed. A new order inherits not just property, but continuity. Here is the historical fact. Most of the Templars in Portugal were never arrested. Dinis hesitated, delayed, negotiated. He told the Vatican he would comply, then buried the warrant under layers of council review. By the time pressure arrived, the moment had passed. The Knights were still there, less visible perhaps, but undisturbed. When the Order of Christ was formed, many of these same men simply reappeared under different titles. João Lourenço, a senior Templar officer in central Portugal, vanishes from records in 1310. He resurfaces in 1321 as the commander of the newly minted Order of Christ estate. In Castro Marim, same region, same estate, same duties. The robe a different hue, the seal slightly altered, but everything else intact. Some might argue this was simply bureaucratic convenience. Portugal could not afford to lose the Templars' infrastructure, especially with Castile pressing its borders and Moorish raids still a threat. But that does not explain the subtle gestures of continuity that appear across the Order's early years. The Cross of the Order of Christ, often called the Cross Fleury, is a red variation of the Templar emblem, stylized, flared at the ends, but unmistakably rooted in the old design. Its placement on ships, on fortresses, even on coinage, suggests not a break from the past, but a tribute, a whisper of the old allegiance. Then there are the rituals. While most records of Templar rites were suppressed or destroyed, fragments survive: initiation prayers, gestures of secrecy, formulas of obedience. Many of these were quietly retained by the Order of Christ. One early 14th century rulebook includes a clause: "The brother shall offer silence as his shield and discipline as his blade." This phrase, not found in Benedictine or Augustinian traditions, is nearly identical to lines from Templar manuals uncovered in southern France. Even the locations remained the same. Tomar, the spiritual heart of the Portuguese Templars, became the headquarters of the new order. Its round church, a model of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, remained unchanged. The cloisters, the dormitories, the chapel, they were reused, not reimagined. As if the order had simply taken a breath, changed its name, and resumed its march. One of the most revealing documents is a ledger from 1,325 listing expenses for the repair of sacred archives and the copying of Eastern charts. The phrase Eastern charts is ambiguous, but some scholars believe it refers to maps and star tables acquired during the Crusades. Why, years after the fall of the Holy Land, would a new order spend funds preserving old Crusader navigation materials? Unless, of course, those materials were part of an ongoing project, one that never ended. Here lies the deeper mystery. The Order of Christ did not just survive, it thrived. In the 15th century, it became the financial engine behind Portugal's Age of Discovery. Prince Henry, the Navigator, one of the Order's most famous Grand Masters, used its funds and infrastructure to launch expeditions down the coast of Africa and into the Atlantic. Ships bearing the Order's cross explored Madeira, the Azores, and eventually Brazil. The Templar cross, reborn as the Christ cross, circled the globe. This raises a provocative question. Were these voyages mere exploration, or were they extensions of an older mission? Could the Templars, or those who inherited their mantle, have passed down knowledge of distant lands, kept in encoded scrolls, in architectural secrets, in whispered legend? There is, of course, no proof, only patterns. But some maritime historians have noted that the early Portuguese navigators seemed to possess data far beyond what their maps suggested. Currents predicted before they were charted, stars known before they were named. One Jesuit scholar in the 17th century wrote that the Order of Christ carried the old fire in a new lamp. It is a poetic phrase, but perhaps also literal, because what we see in Portugal is not a cover-up. It is a strategy, a controlled metamorphosis, an official laundering of identity that allowed continuity without defiance. The Vatican had no choice but to bless it. The king had no reason to resist it. And the brothers, those who had survived suppression, exile, or silence, had everything to gain from it. The open question is not whether the Order of Christ was born from the Templars. That much is nearly certain. The question is whether, beneath the surface, it remained the Templars in thought, in structure, and in purpose. If so, then they never left. They simply changed names, walked back into the sun, and kept moving. Flags raised, ships sailing, stones whispering. And what other organization in history has died so spectacularly, only to be reborn with greater reach? There are many ways to disappear. Some hide underground, others in shadows. But the most effective place to vanish, especially for a disciplined, structured, financially sophisticated organization like the Templars, is inside the machinery of something even bigger: something legitimate, something busy, something like commerce. Enter the Hanseatic League, a sprawling, German-dominated confederation of trading guilds that during the 14th and 15th centuries connected the Baltic to the North Sea, London to Novgorod, Bruges to Bergen. Ships, warehouses, customs officials, ledgers, all woven into a dense transnational web of influence. If the Templars had wanted to hide a message, a relic, or a man in motion, they could not have asked for better camouflage. The League was founded officially in the mid-1300s, just a few decades after the order was disbanded. Its birth was secular, merchant-driven, but its organizational chart, its use of symbols, rituals, codes of loyalty, and regional houses with rotating leadership, it feels oddly familiar. Let us begin with what we know. Several key Hanseatic cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Cologne, contained former Templar properties. Some were seized outright by local powers. Others, curiously, were transferred to newly formed guilds with no direct religious ties. One warehouse in Hamburg, long thought to be a grain storage site, was discovered during a renovation to contain a hidden chapel beneath its foundation. Octagonal, stone-hewn, bearing the faded relief of a sword entwined with ivy. The iconography does not match standard Christian motifs, but it does resemble a carving from a Templar commandery in Burgundy. Same sword, same entwined form, same subtle curvature. One historical fact complicates the story. In the early 14th century, as the Templars were dissolving in France and Iberia, there was a notable influx of administrative talent into northern trade guilds. Chroniclers in Lübeck and Danzig noted southern men with unusual habits of prayer and accounting. They did not wear uniforms, but they arrived with ledgers, with experience in logistics, and, most tellingly, with no fixed home. These were not the loud kind of immigrants. They did not marry into the merchant families. They did not build churches, but they were hired, trusted, promoted. Why? Because they understood movement. They knew how to track grain across borders, how to negotiate customs tariffs, how to deliver high-value goods safely over dangerous terrain, and they had contacts not just in Bruges and London, but in Cyprus, Sicily, and the western coast of Africa. One curious document found in the Bremen State Archive refers to old scripts used for the Southern Ledger. The document does not clarify what these scripts were, but the handwriting, when compared to preserved Templar financial notes, is a near match. The same looping ascenders, the same peculiar abbreviation of the word sacramentum as a sideways S. It is a small thing, but habits like that do not appear by accident. Then there is the language. Among Hanseatic merchants, a hybrid trade tongue emerged. Part German, part Norse, part Latin, but nestled within it are phrases that raise eyebrows. Sanguis inter merces, blood among goods, used to denote protected cargo. Domus occulta, the hidden house, as a label for relay points between cities. These are not common expressions, and yet similar phrases appear in Templar property records. Domus secreti, house of secrets. Via sanguinis, way of blood. The overlap is not proof, but it is smoke. What scholars quietly debate is whether the Hanseatic League became an accidental vessel for Templar refugees, or whether it was deliberately used as a cloak. Could former Templar financial officers have found sanctuary inside its system? Could they have smuggled assets, ideas, or personnel under the guise of grain and cloth? One tantalizing clue lies in the structure of the kontor, or foreign trading post. These were essentially Hanseatic embassies, guarded, self-governing, and equipped with chapel-like halls used for meetings. The most famous was in Bruges, but one lesser-known kontor in Bergen, Norway, contains an archive room sealed until the 1800s. Inside, historians found a set of wall markings, not graffiti, but deliberate symbols. A star, a stepped cross, and beside it the words, Vox Manet, the voice remains. The Bergen markings match carvings found in a ruined commandery near Toulouse. Same angles, same height from the floor. One carved in stone, the other scratched into wood. Two locations never connected by official history. Yet trade routes tell a different story. Goods moved between them. Timber, iron, parchment. And where goods move, people follow. There is another layer. Hanseatic ships were not just cargo carriers. They were messages in motion. And in the ship's logs of one vessel, Die Hoffnung, dated 1342, a strange entry appears. Delivered the letter to the brothers of the quiet coast. No further explanation. The destination listed is a small fishing port near the mouth of the Loire, once a known Templar landing site. The captain's name, unknown. It is here that the open question sharpens. Did the Templar network dissolve, or did it metastasize into the very veins of medieval commerce? If so, it was a clever move. A knight draws attention. A merchant does not. A crusader is interrogated. A quartermaster is waved through. And in a world driven increasingly by coin rather than crusade, hiding within trade was not just smart, it was survival. The Hanseatic League grew powerful, then declined. But its ghost lingers in shipping laws, in customs codes, in maritime charts still used today. And perhaps, if you look closely, its legacy includes more than goods. It may have carried memory. The kind of memory etched not in stone or scripture, but in the creak of timbers, the weight of grain, the silent glance passed between strangers at a port, because when an order dies and leaves no graves, it must have buried itself somewhere, and there is no soil deeper than trade. Not every survival is military. Not every network is made of ships and stone. Some exist in minds, in rituals, in whispers passed between cloisters under the sound of bells. When the Templars vanished from the public stage, many looked to ports, to mountains, to noble houses for signs of their endurance. But some turned their attention inward, into the church itself, and in the flicker of candlelight behind monastery walls, in obscure sects and forgotten movements, they began to suspect something stranger. That part of the Templar network may have survived not outside the church, but within it. At first, the idea seems paradoxical. The church dissolved the order, burned its leaders, condemned it as heretical. How could the very institution that destroyed the Templars have sheltered their legacy? But history, especially church history, is rarely linear, and the lines between condemnation and adoption are often thinner than they appear. Begin with a simple recorded fact. Not all Templars were knights. A significant portion of the order was composed of sergeants, scribes, priests, and lay brothers non-combatants, monastic personnel. When the arrest warrants went out, many of these men were not imprisoned. They simply disappeared into the folds of other religious houses, absorbed, retitled, reassigned. And while the Vatican may have disbanded the hierarchy, it never hunted every last brother across every last cloister. It could not. In southern France, where Cathar heresies had recently been extinguished, a quiet convergence was already taking shape. Small monastic communities, still wary of Rome's fire, became natural shelters for displaced Templar clergy. In some cases, abbeys previously owned by the order remained in use under new names, but with the same staff. One priory in the Pyrenees retained a brother Elias listed in records from both 1306 and 1319, before and after the suppression, with no change in role. The same hand signs, church documents. The same meticulous inventory logs continue. These continuities might be dismissed as clerical oversights, but the pattern appears across multiple regions. In Tuscany, a Dominican friar named Matteo authored a series of sermons in the 1320 seconds, referencing the hidden servants of the swordless temple, a phrase not recognized in standard Catholic theology. His writings, long ignored, contain strange mathematical marginalia, sequences of numbers, ratios, diagrams, none of which relate to the homiletic content. Some believe they are cipher keys. Even more curious is the persistence of certain liturgical gestures, tiny deviations in the Mass used only in isolated monasteries. A double touch to the brow instead of one, a pause before the Sanctus. These anomalies are not doctrinal errors, they are traditions, and some trace them back to Templar rites, preserved in fragments from Iberia and Languedoc. But perhaps the most unsettling thread runs through mystical sects and movements accused, often unfairly, of heresy. The Beguines, the Brethren of the Free Spirit, later even the Rosicrucians, these were not Templars, but many shared habits, language, and an intense focus on inner knowledge, divine geometry, and the idea of hidden truth passed only to the worthy. Some researchers argue that as the Templars were broken publicly, their spiritual undercurrent bled into these groups, an underground church that operated parallel to Rome. In one late 14th century manuscript found in a Benedictine scriptorium in Austria, a monk named Johannes records a vision of a black-cloaked brotherhood walking beneath the roots of the cathedral, holding lightless lamps and keys without teeth. The imagery is obscure, but it echoes descriptions found in earlier Templar texts, particularly those involving the initiation of inner circle members. What stands out is the phrase, keys without teeth, a metaphor used to describe non-literal access, not to buildings, but to knowledge. There is also a persistent rumor surrounding Chartres Cathedral, often celebrated for its Gothic beauty and enigmatic symbolism. A few historians have suggested that its labyrinth, rose windows, and subterranean crypts contain not merely Christian allegory, but embedded messages, a code for those who knew how to read sacred architecture. Some even propose that former Templar masons, displaced and nameless, worked on its later restorations and left behind geometrical ciphers. One segment of the nave, when mapped using Templar ratios, aligns perfectly with the constellation Virgo, known in medieval esotericism as the keeper of hidden light. Then, there is the matter of relics. In ecclesiastical inventories from the 14th century onward, several minor monasteries report possessing artifacts of obscure provenance. Fragments of stone, inscriptions in no known tongue, reliquaries labeled simply "Gift of the Silent Brethren." These items are not catalogued in major church lists, nor do they appear to have been officially transferred from Templar holdings. Some are shaped with a degree of craftsmanship, unusual for their supposed era. 1. A star-shaped metal disc, found in a chapel in Provence, contains engravings resembling both Hebrew and Phoenician script, neither of which had any place in a 14th century Catholic relic chest. Were these remnants of Templar acquisitions spirited away before the order's collapse and safeguarded in cloisters under assumed purpose? Were the monks who guarded them simply unaware or silently complicit? The open question, then, is whether the Templars' religious ideas, their internal doctrines, their mystical frameworks, their codes, survived through spiritual osmosis. Did they leave behind not a political legacy but a theological current, one that trickled through monasteries, found echo in mystics, and re-emerged centuries later as the roots of secret brotherhoods and esoteric societies? There is no proof, no papal confession, no grand scroll titled "The Plan," but there are threads too many, too aligned, too persistent to ignore. And unlike the physical trail of ships and stones, this spiritual trail is harder to kill. It needs no vault. It leaves no ledger. It lives in gesture, in liturgy, in the curve of a chapel roof. If the Templars did build an underground church, it would not look like Rome. It would look like silence, like ritual without explanation, like a gospel never written, but passed hand to hand, heart to heart, until the meaning itself became the vault. And somewhere, perhaps, it still flickers in the chant of an obscure abbey, in a labyrinth few notice, or in a prayer that sounds just a little too old for its supposed age. There are some things a name will not tell you. Titles fade, orders dissolve, armies retreat, but blood remembers. If you believe that the Templars disappeared entirely after their fall, then you may not have looked closely enough at who inherited their land, who married their daughters, who built strange additions onto their manors with stone that came from no local quarry. The true legacy of the Templars may not have survived through monasteries or ships or even secret archives, but through families, noble families, the kind with long memories, quiet chapels, and a tendency to avoid too many questions. One solid historical fact: when the Templar lands were confiscated, they did not always end up with the Hospitallers. In theory, yes, the papal decree was clear. In practice, much of the land passed into the hands of regional nobility through temporary custodianship, marital inheritance, or, most suspiciously, through donations to newly formed monastic houses with personal ties to Templar officials. In Burgundy alone, dozens of Templar estates shifted directly into the control of minor noble families within 10 years of the suppression, with no clear financial transaction recorded. Some of these families had long-standing connections to the order. Others gained wealth with astonishing speed and discretion. A particularly notable case is the Brienne family, whose holdings in Champagne expanded significantly after 1312. Coinciding with their sudden appearance as patrons of multiple small religious communities, none of which reported to Rome directly, their family crest, revised around that time, began to include an equal-armed cross behind a stag's head, a design never formally recognized by heraldic authorities, but remarkably similar to sigils found in Templar chapels in the Holy Land. Across Europe, similar patterns repeat. Families with previously modest influence began funding chapels, hiring private tutors fluent in Latin and geometry, and hosting foreign guests who stayed for months but left no record. One noblewoman in Provence, Marguerite de Villefranche, founded a convent in 1327 that required all its sisters to take a vow of silence regarding its patron. The foundation charter survives, but the line with the founder's name has been meticulously scratched out and rewritten in a different hand. More than a few researchers have noticed how some of these families seem to intermarry repeatedly, forming tight generational loops that preserve names, coats of arms, and perhaps knowledge. This is not unusual among noble classes. What is unusual is the recurrence of symbolic motifs: stars, equal-armed crosses, twin horses, ladders of 7 steps. These are not common medieval themes. They appear instead in Templar art, inscriptions, and even seals. The implication is not just aesthetic, but initiatory marks of belonging, or at least of memory. One of the more obscure but compelling threads involves a manuscript found in the private collection of a Silesian count in the 18th century. The document, now housed in the National Library of Poland, lists a genealogical record spanning centuries. Among its entries are several cryptic notations: oath given at Tomar, heard the sign at Roslin, saw the stone of the east. These are not places on a map. They are experiences, perhaps stages in a rite of passage. The document also includes names that match known Templar stewards from Cyprus and Burgundy, suggesting either direct descent or a careful imitation. We also return here to the curious absence of certain family records during the suppression years. In Aragon, at least 3 noble households ceased keeping birth records between 1307 and 1314, only to resume after the papal dust had settled. Why? There is no war cited, no plague, no known reason, except perhaps to obscure adoptions or the quiet absorption of displaced brothers into noble lineages. This idea that former Templars were taken in, married off, or simply shielded under new names gains traction when you trace unusual marriages. For example, the union of a widowed Templar clerk with the daughter of a minor English baron in 1316 resulted in the sudden rise of the family's holdings and the construction of a private chapel bearing iconography linked to Solomon's Temple, an obsession that otherwise vanishes from English ecclesiastical design after the suppression. Even the rise of certain professional classes, lawyers, scholars, surveyors, in the decades after 1312, seemed suspiciously populated by individuals with no traceable parentage, yet extensive education. A few theories suggest that some Templar children, especially those born of unofficial unions or adopted into the order's ranks, were absorbed into noble households, groomed for influence, and sent into the world not as knights but as advisors, quiet operators, institutional memory, now walking in civilian clothing. And so the open question: if the order fell, did its heart survive through bloodlines? Were there families that did not just shelter brothers, but became vessels for continuation? If so, it was the most brilliant strategy of all. No buildings to burn, no documents to seize, just names passed like heirlooms, just traditions whispered like lullabies. The modern descendants of these families often carry no visible link to the Templars. Many do not even know the stories. But in a few old houses, there are rooms never used. In attics, boxes sealed with red wax. In vaults, keys with no doors. The Brotherhood may have died in public, but in private, it may have married, raised children, changed its clothes, and written its legacy not in Latin, but in lineage. Because when blood carries memory, there is no need to rebuild the temple. You become it. You might expect that after a public condemnation and an international crackdown, any surviving traces of a once powerful order like the Templars would vanish completely, especially in a kingdom like England, where the monarchy and church moved with decisive coordination. And yet, if you follow the quiet paper trails and the subtle shifts in landholding across the island, you find that something does not quite align with the official story. The Templars may have been publicly dissolved, but in England, the machinery that powered their presence seemed to downshift, not disappear. To begin with, a clear historical fact. The arrests of the Templars in England occurred later than in France. Edward II hesitated. He reportedly respected the Templars and initially refused to believe the charges. Only after direct papal pressure did he order their seizure in 1308, months after the French arrests. Even then, the operations were curiously gentle. In most cases, Templars were placed under house arrest in monasteries. No bonfires, no public trials. And curiously, many retained their clothing and possessions. Now, consider the aftermath. Royal clerks were tasked with inventorying and redistributing Templar properties. Dozens of commanderies, preceptories, and farms dotted the English countryside assets that required significant oversight, but the records left behind reveal a striking pattern. Many of the new custodians were former Templar affiliates or connected through family to known associates of the order. In Lincolnshire, a preceptory passed into the hands of a cousin of the local Templar steward. In Shropshire, a clerk who previously served the order suddenly acquired a post managing Templar lands, despite having no official experience with estate law. Some properties, too, simply vanished from the registry. A manor in Northumberland, once listed as Templar property, is absent from post-dissolution rolls, reappearing decades later under the ownership of a family with no traceable title. Similar anomalies appear in Devon, where a fortified site called White Cross never appears in hospitaller inventories, though Templar accounts show it fully operational just months before the suppression. One of the more obscure but telling episodes involves a land grant in Herefordshire. A small parcel, originally part of a Templar sheep farm, was sold to a minor noble, Sir John de Morville. The purchase price: 3 gold coins, ridiculously low. But the charter includes an unusual clause. Morville must maintain the well on the property for future use by the brethren. No mention of which brethren. No explanation. Just that vague phrase. The well, incidentally, still exists, capped with a stone marked by an equal-armed cross. This hints at a deeper mechanism. Controlled handoffs. Not chaos. Not collapse, a deliberate transition of assets masked as disorder. When examined alongside the broader context of English governance, a larger picture begins to emerge. Unlike in France, where Philip the Fair sought to destroy and confiscate, the English crown seemed to prioritize quiet continuity. Edward II, despite his public compliance, delayed and minimized damage. Some scholars argue this was political cowardice. Others suggest he understood the real utility of the Templars, not as knights, but as networkers. The order's infrastructure offered communication routes, resource management, and an internal courier system far more effective than the royal post. It is also worth noting the curious case of the London Temple, once the Templars' chief English base. After the dissolution, it was handed over to the Hospitallers on paper, but the physical site remained in use for various royal functions, including legal education, private diplomacy, and record storage. One chamber, known as the Round, remained locked for years. No records explain why. Today, it is part of the Inner Temple, a still functioning legal precinct. Coincidence or continuity in a new disguise? Even more intriguing is the presence of Templar symbology in English ecclesiastical architecture after 1312. Chapels built decades later, such as one in Warwickshire, display carvings of twin knights, 8-pointed stars, and ladders flanked by swords. These motifs are not random. They align closely with known Templar iconography from the Holy Land. Their appearance long after the suppression hints that not only the memory, but perhaps the influence of the order lingered quietly, woven into local religious and noble patronage. Which brings us to the open question. Was England not a graveyard for the Templars, but a greenhouse? A place where the order's practices, personnel, and properties were absorbed, not erased? And if so, how much of modern English legal, financial, or architectural infrastructure grew from that seedbed? There is a callback here to the earlier hints from Iberia and Scotland. In those places, too, the order may have survived through adaptation. England, with its slower enforcement, its cooperative elite, and its highly literate bureaucracy, offered something unique: cover. The ability to look official while remaining unofficial, to carry on behind the mask of red tape and royal seal. And perhaps the final irony is this, that a kingdom so often dismissed as peripheral to continental power may have become a key shelter for a network that never intended to die, not just a refuge, but a relay station. Not a collapse, but a change of clothing. At first glance, the roads the Templars built or maintained appear to serve the expected purposes: military movement, pilgrim protection, access to commanderies. But what if those same routes also functioned as arteries of a deeper, more precise system? What if, beneath the pious justification of guiding pilgrims, the Templars had laid out a hidden postal network, complete with coded lodgings, fixed timetables, and silent couriers who never appeared in the records? Let us begin with one firm fact. The Order of the Temple operated over 900 documented commanderies across Europe by the late 13th century. These outposts were not randomly distributed. Instead, they appear at roughly day-long travel intervals, many situated near river crossings, mountain passes, and safe harbor towns. The placement mirrors almost uncannily the requirements of a secure communication relay. This suggests the possibility of a templated system not designed for war but for information. An obscure, rarely cited Templar inventory from the region of Aquitaine lists an annual allocation of horses, parchment, and sealed pouches between 4 commanderies, none of which had seen active battle deployment in decades. The justification: preparations for pilgrimage season. But the items listed include blank cipher wheels, tinted wax tablets, and detailed maps. Pilgrims do not use cipher wheels. Something else was moving along those roads. If you trace the pilgrim routes, especially those to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem, you begin to see overlapping lines with Templar pathways. Lodgings labeled domus or hospitalia often housed well-trained staff fluent in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. A few even had subterranean storage rooms locked by mechanisms that required coded symbols to open. In northern Italy, one such room was discovered in the 1800s during a chapel restoration. Inside, an empty vault with a carved diagram of a 9-pointed star and a Latin inscription that read, "No voice, only the sign." There is also the oddity of travel speeds. Documents suggest messages sent from Aragon to Paris could arrive in under 10 days, even under the best conditions. That is unusually fast. Unless a relay system existed with fresh riders, known stops, and pre-cleared paths. Such efficiency would require more than goodwill. It would require design. And here is where it loops back to earlier signs of encoded behavior. Remember the architectural markers? Some lodgings share identical stone carvings of lions, with twisted tails or staircases built in reversed spirals, details not needed for comfort or defense. But repeated consistently, they could act as silent markers telling a traveling brother, "This place is safe. This place is part of the system." The questions this raises are endless. Who controlled these routes once the order was dissolved? Did the same infrastructure get quietly absorbed into other orders, like the Hospitallers, or even secular merchant guilds? Or was it intentionally left dormant, waiting for the right message, the right seal, the right hand? We also cannot ignore the strange survival of certain phrases in regional dialects. In parts of Languedoc and central Italy, the phrase "Rota del Segno" appears in old maps and oral histories, "route of the sign." In one case, it is linked to a series of wells, all within a mile of known Templar properties. Local legend says the wells connect underground, but no physical tunnel has been found. There is a related point to recall from earlier: the idea of inheritance through families. Some of the noble houses mentioned in the previous inquiry were situated along these routes. Coincidence? Or was land ownership chosen to protect specific nodes in a broader network? It is worth mentioning an odd find near Dover. During a 1,970 seconds expansion of a rural road, workers uncovered a buried stone milestone far from any Roman path. The carving: an equal-armed cross beneath a line of dots. Archaeologists dismissed it as decorative, but cryptographers later noted the dots matched a known cipher grid from 14th century French military use. The stone has since vanished from public display. And what of the pilgrim badges, those small tin icons pilgrims wore as proof of journey? Some bear subtle differences: extra marks, reversed lines, strange dots between letters. A recent study compared dozens found along the Camino de Santiago and found certain marks clustered only at sites near former Templar estates. Could the badges themselves have been used to identify trusted couriers? In some, the evidence forms a trail never definitive, but always suggestive. A line of inns spaced too neatly, riders who move too fast, seals that match too closely, and small signs left like breadcrumbs for those trained to read them. So we arrive at the open question: were these roads the visible part of a hidden circuit? And if so, how long did it operate after the order fell? Some say the routes fell into disuse. Others believe they simply changed hands. But a few, just a few, suggest they never stopped. They simply went quiet, because a road is never just a path. It is a choice, a promise, a direction whispered from one hand to the next across miles of stone and silence. And sometimes the quietest paths carry the most dangerous messages. If you have heard one story about the Templars after their downfall, you have probably heard this one: that they did not vanish. They transformed. That centuries later they re-emerged as Freemasons, cloaked in symbols and ritual, hiding in lodges rather than chapels. It is one of the most persistent popular claims, repeated in books, whispered in documentaries, and proudly displayed in the iconography of modern fraternal orders. But if we are being precise, and we are, the truth is far less cinematic and far more interesting. Let us begin with the grounded fact. The Freemasons, as we know them today, formally emerged in the early 18th century. The foundational moment is usually pegged to 1717, with the unification of 4 London lodges into the Grand Lodge of England. Their rituals, degrees, and symbols, compasses, squares, the all-seeing eye, are now instantly recognizable. But centuries before that, there were operative masons, the actual builders of cathedrals and castles, who passed knowledge through apprenticeships and guild structures. Their secrets were technical, not mystical. So where does the Templar link come in? That is the obscure detail. In the early 1700s, certain Masonic rites, especially those in France and Germany, began inserting overt Templar references into their rituals. Initiates were told that their order preserved the legacy of the Knights Templar. Some rites even reenacted the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay. Others included references to Solomon's Temple, a Templar obsession, and incorporated the double-headed eagle, a symbol later associated with the Scottish Rite. But here is the controversy. There is zero documented evidence, none, that Freemasonry evolved directly from the Templars. No charter, no continuity of leadership, no chain of custody. Instead, what emerges is something more deliberate, a romantic revival. In the Enlightenment era, secret societies wanted lineage, prestige, ancient roots, and the Templars, with their air of tragedy and mystery, were the perfect candidates for symbolic adoption. This raises the open question that continues to baffle historians. Why did the Templar legend surge specifically in Masonic circles and not others? Why did these 18th century architects of fraternity choose a disgraced medieval order as their spiritual forebears? Part of the answer may lie in politics. At the time, anti-clerical sentiment in France was rising. Associating with a group destroyed by the Church allowed early Freemasons to frame themselves as inheritors of suppressed truth. It was not about lineage. It was about rebellion, identity, and myth. That said, there are strange connections worth noting. Some early Masonic manuscripts include passwords and signs uncannily similar to surviving Templar ciphers. A few family lineages involved in both early Freemasonry and Templar asset inheritance appear in key historical junctions. And in one particularly strange example, a carved stone found in a Scottish churchyard bears the classic Templar cross and an early Masonic square and compass side by side, dated to 1681. Is it a modern forgery? A coincidence? Or something more? Let us not forget our earlier exploration of Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, often pointed to as a link between the two groups, built by the Sinclair family, who had ties to both Templar lore and early Freemasonry. The chapel features carvings interpreted as both Masonic symbols and Templar references. But interpretation is not evidence, and there is the risk of seeing patterns because we want them to be there. The callback here brings us to the architecture as code thread. Just as we considered that Templar structures might hold silent messages, so too have Masonic lodges been analyzed for hidden alignments and numerological clues. But this might be less about shared origin and more about shared methods. Both groups used symbol as shield and ceremony as structure. In times of persecution or political tension, metaphor becomes a fortress. Even the idea of degrees, secrecy, and moral progression, so central to Masonic practice, has precedence in the chivalric vows of the Templars. But again, this does not prove continuity. It proves that humans in hierarchies gravitate toward ritual. It proves that sacred drama works. Still, it is tempting, is it not, to imagine that the Templar spirit did not die, but simply moved into stone-cutting guilds, into coded handshakes, into whispered oaths behind locked lodge doors. It is a beautiful narrative, but beauty does not equal proof. So perhaps the real value of this theory lies not in whether it is true, but in why it persists, why we want it to be true. Because the idea of a secret that survives for centuries is comforting. It means something meaningful endured, that someone, somewhere, is still guarding the flame. But sometimes, the echo of an order is louder than its voice ever was. Sometimes all that remains is the silhouette projected across time by those who needed a past grand enough to support their present. And sometimes, the secret was never continuity. It was adoption. You were not supposed to find it. Not you. Not anyone. It was meant to be forgotten, buried in a false wall behind a centuries-old chapel in southern France. When the workers broke through during a restoration project in 2006, they expected dust, maybe an old drainage channel. What they found instead was a narrow stone chamber sealed by iron brackets. Inside, stacked in oilcloth and beeswax, were bundles of parchment, sealed tubes of scrolls, and a single carved wooden box marked only by an equal-armed cross and a crescent. The French Ministry of Culture classified the site within days. The contents were removed, catalogued, and locked away. For nearly a decade, no one outside a handful of archivists and church historians even knew it existed until someone talked. Let us begin with what is confirmed. There was indeed a cache found beneath the chapel of Saint Jean de Bonneval, near the ruined Templar stronghold of Boise. The ministry's own press release from 2015 mentions unusual pre-modern documents of unknown origin and a significant archaeological and religious heritage discovery. But the details stop there. No scans released, no transcription, no official acknowledgement of connection to the Knights Templar. But according to an anonymous source, an archivist who claimed to have handled and translated some of the contents, what lay inside the scroll tubes was disturbing not in the sense of danger or blasphemy, but in how normal it was. Ledger books, lists of names and payments, land transfers dated well after 1312, the official year. The order was dissolved. And perhaps most curious, correspondence. Letters between preceptors in what is now Switzerland, northern Italy, and the Pyrenees. Not formal communications, friendly notes, logistics, instructions for winter supplies, arrangements for moving goods through the corridor. No sign of war, no sense of desperation, just business as usual. The implications are staggering. If these documents are genuine, and their ink, parchment, and dialect suggest they are, they point to a functioning administrative Templar presence operating decades after their supposed destruction. And not hiding, simply rebranded, moving under new names, trading with the same merchants, managing the same estates. Of course, not all experts agree. Some scholars have suggested the archive is a clever 19th century forgery, a romantic nationalist attempt to connect France with lost nobility. But forensic analysis of one scroll's ink revealed components consistent with early 14th century iron gall ink, not used after the 1500s. And the wax seals, while damaged, include known Templar sigils, not reconstructed ones, but rare variants, matching earlier finds in Limoges and Aragon. One particular document stands out. It appears to be a travel manifest, a list of cargo moved between 5 stations, ending in the port city of Genoa. Among the items, 4 crates of medicinal tinctures, 7 sacks of saffron, 1 box of copper seals, and a sealed reliquary, labeled M. No further explanation, just the letter. That same box appears referenced in a note found folded into an account book delivered to the brother from the Marches. His mark is the sign of 3 points. The Marches, a reference to the borderlands of England and Wales. Could this be the same region discussed earlier in our inquiry into the English web? This callback matters. It suggests the archive is not isolated. It interlocks with whispers we have already heard. The controlled transitions, the quiet handoffs, the signature phrases used without explanation. Then there is the box, the one with the cross and the crescent. It was not opened on site. It was reportedly taken to Paris for analysis. Months later, rumors began circulating about its contents. A set of brass rings, an engraved astrolabe, and a bound codex in a language no one immediately recognized. The archivist claims the codex is not Templar, but something older, preserved by them. The writing resembles Syriac. One image shows a stylized map, concentric circles around a central square, radiating lines like a star chart. Was it astronomical, mystical, a guide? Here lies the open question. Perhaps the final one in this long investigation. If the Templars preserved not only their own records, but relics or texts from other traditions, possibly even older than Christianity, what exactly were they trying to protect? A trade route, a philosophy, a memory too dangerous for the dominant powers? Some say this archive proves the Templars never ended, that their network simply changed form and continued across generations under the noses of kings and popes alike. Others argue it is a red herring. One more legend, tacked onto a history already too heavy with myth. But it exists. That part is not theory. The chamber was real. The scrolls were real. And somewhere, even now, they are locked behind reinforced glass in a private archive whose location remains undisclosed. We are told it is for preservation, for safety, for study. But the irony is thick. A group once accused of hoarding secrets beyond the reach of church and crown may have left behind a secret too fragile for modern eyes. So we end this phase of the journey, not with fire or betrayal or graves dug in the dark, but with a room full of paper, quiet, patient, and utterly unwilling to let go. Step back now. Let your mind rest on everything you have uncovered. On roads hidden in plain sight, on vaults behind chapel walls, on symbols carved into stone that once seemed decorative, but now feel directional. Breathe in the weight of it all. Centuries of whispers, disjointed fragments, half-buried relics, an improbable continuity that somehow resists erasure. You have walked across Europe in the footprints of a brotherhood the world insists was destroyed. But what if we stop looking at each thread and start observing the weave? Let us trace it gently. The Templars, as they stood in the 12th and 13th centuries, were not merely warrior monks. They were logistical geniuses. Their influence stretched from England to Jerusalem. They owned land, built fortresses, lent money, and protected pilgrims. They had every reason to develop an internal communication and transport system that could function independently of kings and bishops. We established early on that their commanderies were laid out not randomly, but rhythmically, spaced for horse and foot, interlocked by seasonal roads and coastal access. That is the skeleton. Layer on top of that, the financial infrastructure, safe deposits, letters of credit, sophisticated ledgers, not just lending, but record-keeping, recognition of seals, trusted intermediaries. Europe's first shadow banking system, run by men who wore swords over tunics marked with a cross. And once that system was built, it did not need the temple. It just needed continuity, a shift of title, a new sigil on the same scroll. Overlay the noble houses, those quiet allies who never burned the Templar properties on their lands, who inherited farms, castles, and codes of loyalty, who married sons and daughters into other families, equally complicit. Suddenly, you do not need open allegiance. You need only inheritance and memory. Now, remember the islands: Malta, Rhodes, Cyprus, stepping stones across the sea, all eventually controlled by orders with convenient overlaps. Continuity of purpose, continuity of location. And who came knocking centuries later? Explorers, cartographers, traders on ships, following routes the Templars once knew, by night and by star. Then consider the languages, the symbols, the seals found long after the arrests, the scripts discovered in church basements, the strange hand-drawn maps referencing roads not on any kingdom's register. You start to see that coordination does not always look like a line. Sometimes it is a whisper that reappears on another continent in a different century. And if you are still unsure, revisit that archive, the one that should not exist. What does it say? That communications continued, that instructions were issued, that goods moved and were received, long after Mole's ashes fell into the Seine. His brothers, whether in title or just in spirit, were still at work. Which leads to the question at the center of all this. Did the Templars survive as an order or as a method? Because if you view them not as a singular institution, but as a framework, a set of principles, routes, habits, and encoded behavior, then survival no longer depends on hierarchy. It becomes a pattern, and patterns are harder to kill than men. Here is the unifying theory. After the arrests in France, the visible structure of the order collapsed, but the tools remained. The networks, the vaults, the boats moored in quiet harbors, the friends in noble houses. The seals passed hand to hand. Some of it transformed legally, as in Portugal. Some of it faded into guilds or orders of a different name. But much of it went quiet, passing underground, not out of fear, but strategy. The Templars did not fall. They transitioned. The final shape was not a phoenix, not a rebirth. It was a diffusion. Their knowledge diluted into lodges and monasteries, into banking families and coastal towns. Their symbols echoed in rites, in architecture, in the uncanny repetition of crosses, octagons, and sunwheels on buildings centuries apart. So what remains today? What can we point to? Not much. A few crumbling stones, a sword in a museum, a name on a wine bottle. But that is the genius of it. True survival leaves no single target, just ripples. A whisper in a lodge, a phrase passed down, a relic locked in a family vault, and sometimes a sealed chamber behind an old wall, waiting. The web is there. You just have to stop looking for straight lines. Start looking for signs. Close your eyes, if you like. Let the shapes of what you have heard linger behind your eyelids. Archways flickering with torchlight, roads that coil like serpents across forgotten countrysides, and seals impressed into wax that once bound words no longer spoken aloud. Let it settle into quiet, because now we drift not into revelation but reflection. You have wandered with the ghosts of the temple for hours, walked corridors beneath cathedrals, and passed beneath oak branches that remember too much. You have seen the evidence build not as a fortress of stone, but as something more fragile, more enduring. A network without banners, an idea that survived not by shouting, but by stepping softly. The Templars, those warrior monks in white and red, may no longer ride under their ancient rule, but their echoes live on in the old roads that still mark the countryside, in the geometry of churches where light bends at impossible angles, in lodges where strange rites are passed down with care and reverence, and in names, quiet names on deeds and ledgers, in the corners of forgotten books, waiting for someone to ask again. Perhaps that is what they left behind most of all. Not gold, not relics, but a pattern. a way of building trust that did not need permission, a way of moving unseen, but never aimless, a way of waiting until the world was ready to listen again. So if you feel something stir when you see a red cross on white stone, or walk an unfamiliar street that somehow feels mapped in your bones, trust it. You are not imagining the weight of history. You are feeling the breath of something that never died. It only stepped aside. And now you have heard its story, thread by thread, whisper by whisper. Let it fade gently. Let it rest beneath your feet, where it has always waited, where it will wait still.